across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
And yes, good afternoon. Welcome back to the home of Common Sense. Thank you to Julia. She's back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So the Conservatives are exploring a potential alliance with Nigel Farage's Reform UK to counter Labour's dominance. Polls show Reform overtaking the Tories. However, Mr Farage has ruled out any kind of pact, vowing instead to return Britain to greatness. We'll have more on that. Should Reform and the Tories form a coalition? It's got to be the only way, right? Also this afternoon, 2 Labour MPs have been exposed as key members of a WhatsApp group sharing racist, sexist, anti-Semitic messages. The scandal has sparked a police investigation as well as a bit of public outrage. And I think what is interesting about this, and if it wasn't, some of the stuff is pretty grim that was written on there. In any other world, it would just be funny to hear these virtuous socialists telling us that, you know, this is the only way to live your life. We are the custodians of morality. We don't do any of that horrible stuff. Oh, hang on a sec. Check your WhatsApp, you filth merchants. And an Albanian criminal avoided deportation after a tribunal ruled it would be unduly harsh on his son, who reportedly refuses to eat foreign chicken nuggets. Yeah, you've heard the story. The case was part of a record backlog of asylum appeals, sparked a bit of outrage and renewed calls for stricter immigration laws. Interestingly, Labour are doing more than the Tories did in the last year in terms of expulsions and the like. We'll look more at that in just a little bit. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. So the Tories kind of, would you say they left the door open? This has been a thing, the potential marriage between the Conservatives and Reform UK, really just since the last election. So last July, there were people chatting about it. There were already some Conservatives that legged it over the fence to join Reform. But it really developed legs, if you like, from July the 4th last year, when the Conservatives got the greatest bruising in something like 100 years, and Reform UK, a party that has only been around for half an hour, turned up with 5 members of Parliament in Westminster. Now, that is significant given the first-past-the-post way that we do business in this country. It is massive, OK? In electoral, so if you're a student of politics and you love kind of electoral facts and figures and stats, and you study that kind of stuff, then it's monumental in terms of the shift. What makes it, of course, even more monumental as the months have gone on, we have seen Reform UK's star rise even further, even topping opinion polls, regularly topping opinion polls above the Conservatives. That's the biggest danger point really for them. There's going to be red seats that they will never ever inhabit, no matter, you know, what you did with the party. But the blue ones, the Conservative ones, this is open for all sorts of interpretation. And it was kind of reignited yesterday when one of the shadow ministers, Alex Burghardt, refused to... He was asked 3 times, you know, whether they would form a party to create a, quote, right-wing juggernaut. And he wouldn't say no. He refused to say, no, we won't. We wouldn't entertain such a thing. I mean, previously, Kemi Badenoch has been quite vocal. Why would, I'm paraphrasing here, you know, why would we want to do business with a party that wants to obliterate us and things such as that? Reform UK last night, by the way, ruled out any deal with the Tories, saying there are no circumstances where they would strike a pact. That, by the way, I don't believe to be totally true. I understand why they've said it. They slapped down the idea after senior Tories, including Jacob Rees-Mogg, suggested teaming up to avoid a wipeout at the next election. So the next election, 2029, just think about this. The Reform UK cannot win and won't win that election. They wouldn't win the one after either with any certainty. But they certainly wouldn't win the next one. You couldn't... But hang on. Let's row back a bit, all right? They of course, theoretically, anyone could win the Green Party could win the next election, but you have to look at probability and likelihood, and there is no probability and likelihood that all of those Labour seats, the hundreds of Labour seats, are suddenly going to turn Reform. They just aren't going to do that. Some of them might be a few red wall ones out there that go, do you know what, I like this Farage character, I like the cut of his jib. Let's go for some of that. But it's going to be tiny in amount. The Tories will get a kicking. Reform would come back with a significant rise in the number of MPs. They could be well into the double digits. In my head, I sort of see the number 60 or 70. Reform UK MPs. That puts them in the kind of Lib Dem territory. In fact, probably just behind the Lib Dems, with the Tories licking their wounds and probably closing shop. But this is about winning an election. So the Tories are scuppered at the next election. If the question is only about winning in 2029, the Tories haven't got a chance, and neither have Reform UK. It's as simple as that. Put them together, and they would probably win. I think there is almost no doubt that they would beat Labour from office. I also think there's almost no doubt that there will be some kind of pact between the two of them. Now, you might love that idea, you might loathe that idea. Either way, that would be the only way you could get any kind of centre-right success, by putting the two together. Should Reform and the Tories form a coalition? Now, I'm talking to you as a supporter of Reform, firstly, 0344 499 1000. But I want to speak to you as a Conservative. If you are one of those still hanging on with the hope that Kemi, or perhaps somebody else, I'm not absolutely sure, she'll still be there by 2029, but I think if you are still loyal to the blue brand and still feel that the Conservatives are your party and you don't normally want any meddling, because you've got to remember, there's a sort of one nation Conservative who absolutely loathe Nigel Farage and people like that. Sort of Damien Greens of this world would preposterous idea. But they might just get it if they think that's the only way to win. So if you're a Tory, if you're Reform, 0344 499 1000. If you're anyone else in between, then I want to hear your assessment as to whether this could work. Let's speak to Zoe Grinowald, who's the political journalist and broadcaster, back with us. Zoe, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Ian.
Nice to have you with us again. I mean, this is an interesting one, isn't it? If it's about, excitement in politics, regardless of anyone's allegiances, I mean, we certainly got it at the last election, and we've got this kind of ongoing narrative of this party that was invented 5 minutes ago, suddenly finding itself at the top of opinion polls. We can argue forever as to why that might be, but nonetheless, I think it's reasonable to say these are changing times, and the two-party system appears to be wobbling.
I think that's true. I mean, we've seen other parties throughout history who have challenged that two-party system element. You had, for example, the Lib Dems had a real kind of resurgence, and obviously they did pretty well in the last general election as well. But because of our two-party system, there tends to be a cap on what these parties can reasonably achieve. Now, the difference here, as you've said in your opening gambit, Ian, is that the Conservatives, who were previously the incredibly dominant, one of the very dominant parties in the two-party system, are now encountering a real fracturing, which could totally divide them and could change the way they interact with Reform. So that's a really important aspect to this. The other element is, of course, Nigel Farage himself, who has, really strong name recognition across the country, which really helps to promote Reform's message. Now, the thing that still remains the issue is not only the fact that there are plenty of Conservatives within the party and Conservative voters who would not countenance a deal with Reform, and also that two-party system, which does put the brakes on. But then you do have other parties, you talk about the Lib Dems, we talk about the Greens, who are also challenging that two-party system. And I think there is increasing pressure across the political spectrum, left and right, to maybe look at electoral reform. But if you were the Labour Party looking at these polls, looking at the fact that you want to achieve things across a 10-year period, you're not going to put electoral reform anywhere towards the top of the agenda.
Absolutely. It's interesting that the top team of Tories, Kemi Badenoch and co, have always, when asked, said, no, we would never do this. And I think I sort of slightly paraphrased Kemi when she said, why would I want to, do business with a party that wants to destroy us? But there was this kind of break from that yesterday. We can have a little listen to this, Zoe. This is Shadow Minister Alex Burghardt, no, me neither, has refused to rule out any kind of pact with Reform UK. He was asked 3 times about this and he wouldn't say no. Let's have a listen.
I very strongly believe that Kemi Badenoch is going to be able to lead the Conservative Party to victory at the next election. She's incredibly capable. She's pulled together a very good top team, and she is holding the government to account on its disastrous budget, its failed negotiation over Chagos, its failure to set up a full public inquiry into the rape gangs, and also look, the Reform Party is saying that it wants to destroy the Conservative Party. That's not a basis for meaningful talks. I'm focused on us getting a Conservative majority at the next election.
Well, he would say that now, Zoe, wouldn't he? But, I mean, if you look at some of the numbers that have been crunched on this one, that a unified, quote, mega party, it's a horrible expression, could secure 353 MPs, leaving Labour with 174, according to the electoral calculus. I mean, that would be huge, right? I mean, what's not to like for either of those parties?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the maths as they are, it almost seems like a kind of open and shut case. But I think that there's a couple of issues. The first is obviously that this is just a poll, and polls say lots of things. Yep. And we also have 4 years till the next election. So, feasibly things can change. A lot of that depends on Labour's success to get its plans through, and I am slightly worried, about the scale of their ambition in terms of being able to achieve that. The other is, what we alluded to earlier, which is that actually there are plenty of people within the Conservative Party, though some may want a deal that would, as you pointed out, the one nationists, those kind of, the sort of almost centre-right part of the Tory party that was quite dominant for the past few years, which was purged quite considerably actually under Boris Johnson and through the Brexit years, but for whom is still, a big portion of not only the vote but the membership remains, or rather not the membership but the MPs. They would be very worried about a deal with Reform. And the other thing is that Nigel Farage, I would imagine, would not want Reform to be absolved into the Tories. I think he would want to keep some of that control, some of that, he would want to be seen as the architect of this. Yeah. I think for a lot of Conservatives, that would mean throwing off the Conservative brand. And I think, that can be a huge part of it. Is that going to be a big Reform party, or is that going to be a big Conservative party? And that's where some of those political negotiations, I think, would fall away quite quickly.
I mentioned Alex Burghardt there, not necessarily a name that would have full recognition. Here's another MP whose name might not be, or certainly wouldn't have been maybe a few hours ago, Oliver Ryan, the Labour MP. He's only about 11, this fella, but he's, everybody thought, he's a rising star. But now he's been unmasked, always that expression, as the second Westminster member in this, what's being called a vile WhatsApp group, all sorts of racist, anti-Semitic, sexist, homophobic comments in there. I still don't understand, Zoe, why anybody in today's day and age are not aware of the old WhatsApp trap, which seems to have taken down coppers and high-profile people all over the place. And yet here we had at least 2 MPs that we know not being particularly pleasant on the group known as Trigger Me Timbers.
Yeah, this is really disappointing. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, Labour and parties on the left do tend to be, they tend to want to present themselves as often the moral high ground on these things. They don't want to be seen as in any way racist, sexist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic. And, when you're in government, you have to hold a really high standard. And I am shocked that they would have this kind of big WhatsApp group where they feel, not only that they hold these views and feel they're acceptable to make jokes about minorities in this way, but that they would feel able to do it in a group with other people in there. I mean, that to me is such, that alone is a sin, that level of naivety when you are a government minister. And I think the Labour Party, I think there are people in there who are really, they really care about these things, and they are progressives. And just as like there are in all parties, there are people in there who hold these kind of views, and they need to be called out for them. It's not acceptable in any political party, and I'm glad to see that he resigned. But I think Labour maybe need to confront the misogyny and the anti-Semitism and the racism within their ranks and make sure they're stamping it out. They're the governing party.
Indeed. And it always strikes me as kind of curious how involved some people get with these kind of WhatsApp groups. I mean, you look at somebody like me, Zoe, you see cool young buck, clearly tech savvy, knows his stuff. I was on WhatsApp before anybody had heard of flipping WhatsApp. I don't think in the entire time I've been on WhatsApp I've sent 2,000 messages. And yet this guy sent 2,000, this is Oliver Ryan, 2,000 just in this one group. I mean, how do you find the time to even do that?
I mean, we know that politics now is done on WhatsApp, and that, as you say, has been an issue for lots of people. I mean, remember Matt Hancock?
I was just thinking that, yes.
All sorts of issues. And the question is, will MPs ever learn? And I really do think this is part of it. I think there is a level of entitlement that sometimes even those people who you don't think would be kind of corrupted by power or entitlement, when they get in a position of authority, when they become an MP, when they get doors held open for them in the House of Commons, that can change people, and it can put people out of touch with reality, which is that you're a public servant. You're not a god, you're not a king. You are held accountable for the things you say, and you should be upholding the highest standards. And I think that is something that is missing amongst some MPs. Not all of them. I think lots of them really do care about the work they do and do always try and behave appropriately. But we have seen time and time again MPs not thinking about their responsibilities.
There it is. Listen, stay with us, Zoe. More stories still to come. Zoe Greenewald is with us on the programme. Lots more to get into. Comments from you on the way as well. 0344 499 1000. Central. And there is a lot to discuss, by the way. It's a mad old news agenda, and it's only the first day of the week. Should Reform of the Tories form a coalition? I mean, that's going to be the only way, collectively, they could win the next election. On their own, neither could do it. I think I'm right in saying that Reform actually had their eye on not the next one, but the one after that, which may well be true. But surely, if you could get a few people over to your side, or you could hop the fence to theirs, wouldn't you want that success sooner rather than later? 0344 499 1000. Coming up on 20 past 1, this is Talk.
At this time of speaking, we still have 30 million slaves around the globe. So it's a little bit absurd. We talk about reparations for people whose great-great-grandparents might have been slaves, but we do nothing about slavery that actually exists. And this is the essence of virtue signaling. This is not about actual caring about people who are under horrible conditions or slave-like conditions or actual slaves. This is about, once again, beating one's chest in a kind of cultural historical masochism of saying, oh my God, we the British were the worst throughout history and therefore we have to pay reparations. The British made the contribution to end slavery. They ended it.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk 0344 499 1000. Lots of stories to get through this afternoon. We are talking, of course, with Zoe Greenawald, the political journalist and broadcaster. This is an absolute beauty, this one, Zoe. I don't think anybody could fail not to see the... I don't know whether this is disturbing or just funny. Immigration Tribunal's decision to block the deportation of an Albanian criminal, partly... We have to stress, partly, because his son refuses to eat foreign chicken nuggets. Sparked a bit of outrage. Let's have a listen to a voice note on this very point that came into Talk this morning.
Just a quick one on the old chicken nugget debate. What is the world coming to? I can't believe this is actually happening. A guy cannot be deported who's a typical recidivist just because his son won't eat the chicken nuggets. You really can't make this stuff up. Great show, Mike.
I was so hoping... I was hoping there's going to be a payoff there, Zoe. I thought if that's all he's going to say, that's not particularly interesting call, but he did it well. I mean, it sort of comes under... I know the Home Office have appealed this, and I think it's still pending a full decision. But you do wonder how that could even be entered into any kind of evidence or conclusion, unless you can tell us differently, Zoe.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but reading the details of the case, it sounds like that particular example was trying to prove something about the child's broader sensory and educational needs. The problem is, it sounds like there wasn't a great deal of evidence submitted about those. So I can see why the Home Office have appealed it. I think the thing about this is, you know, I think when we pick out particular stories, it tends to sensationalise the issue a little bit. Yeah. Really, if it is the case that this child does have sensory and educational needs, and, you know, this child was born and raised in the UK, the idea that he might have to go to a place he's never been, where he would struggle to access SEND education if he really needs it, that is clearly an issue that we can understand. The problem is the lack of evidence. Like, if the Home Office repeals it, perhaps we'll get more detail on that. But I think what we should really be angry about when we look at this is how the Conservatives deliberately underfunded the asylum processing system, leading to this huge backlog, which means that these cases do get held up in the courts. That means that we do hear about these sensationalised examples of people having their claims accepted or denied. Really, if we want to see the backlog processed properly, and if we want to get through it, it needs to be invested in, and we need to make sure that that backlog that was created under the Conservatives is dealt with. Otherwise, you will get these cases. People get very angry about individual cases. The reality is not the individuals, it is the government, the previous government, that allowed this to balloon out of control and, you know, put immense strain on our already overburdened legal system.
It's still a funny story, though, isn't it, with the nugget? I mean, goodness me, if it had been KFC, I'd have had real sympathy there. I would never wish anyone to eat substandard fried chook. I mean, that would just be a crime scene, frankly. We will watch with interest. Yvette Cooper is challenging this as we understand it. And this story as well, Health Secretary Wes Streeting vows to clear war on NHS wokery. He's pledged to crack down on this kind of, quote, nonsense, urging the service to focus on basics like reducing waiting times and improving patient care. Here's what he had to say last week at a Macmillan charity event.
I also need the profession to help. And sometimes there are some really daft things being done in the name of equality, diversity and inclusion, which undermine the cause. For example, there was one member of NHS staff who was merrily tweeting a job ad online and saying part of her practice was anti-whiteness. And I just thought, what the hell does that say to the bloke up in Wigan who's more likely to die, earlier than his more affluent white counterparts down in London. We've got real issues of inequality that affect white working class people.
Sorry about the quality of some of that clip there, but we got the broad point, Zoe. Wes Streeting wading into... Look, I normally have a bit of a self-imposed ban on the word woke. I think it's kind of just sounds a bit like the sort of thing your dodgy uncle might say at a wedding. It's also sort of been reversed engineered and kind of fired back. But there are stories within the wokery kind of debate that do make you scratch your head, and I think Wes Streeting probably picked up on a reasonable one there.
I think Streeting's point was that there is bureaucracy in the NHS that is stopping it from maybe achieving its full potential. And, in any huge, big public service, you're going to have plenty of waste. So I think it's important to look at that. I think, the word wokery, to me, it's a silly word. What does it mean? If we're talking about inclusive language and things, I think the more inclusive the language is, the better. The main point is everyone being treated equally by the health service as it should be? Are people getting the care they desperately need? Is money being wasted on projects when it should go to reducing waiting lists, things like that? And those are the important points. And I think rather than focusing on things like wokery, which, as you say, is a bit of a sort of political, football that we bounce around, we need to focus on the real issues, which again, like the asylum system, is the chronic underinvestment in the NHS, the failure to kind of properly reform it when it needed it. And, looking at these broader issues, which is, health inequalities across the country. You know that you are more likely to die much earlier if you live in a poorer part of the country than in a wealthier part of the country. Those are the sort of things that I think should be looked at. So I do agree that, anything we can do to kind of cut wastage and really get our resources focused on the NHS is great. But if we can do that without overly politicising it, I think that's better for everyone. But
you can be inclusive, can't you? But also apply some common sense. I mean, a woman has a baby, women get pregnant, and if anyone is spending time in a meeting in a hospital saying, I think we should lose the word woman from all of this, then they've got something wrong with them, right? I mean, we don't. That's clearly an area where, have that debate in a university if you fancy. Certainly not in a place that's facing a brutal uphill struggle to sort the nation's health.
I think the best approach to this is always to try and be nuanced and ask people personally, individually, what they want. If people want to have their pronouns respected and they want to be referred to in a certain way, I think, it's what skin is it off anyone's nose to do so. Equally, I, as a woman, if I was seeking healthcare, and we know women are subject to medical misogyny all the time, I would like if they called me a woman. To me, it seems actually that is common sense. You treat people with respect and dignity. If they ask to be referred to in a certain way, you respect that. And, I think that should really be the end of it. I don't think it needs to be a huge political debate. And I do think that political debate sometimes subtracts from the real issues, which is what is going on with our health system.
And finally, this one, I don't know what there is to comment on this other than, wow, aren't beavers cool? Because a colony of beavers in the Czech Republic completed a dam project that had been stalled because they couldn't get it was running out of money and stuff was going wrong and they couldn't get the engineering. So the beavers built dams in planned locations which restored the wetlands. This was decades after there'd been a lot of military activity in the place. Ecologists praised the beavers, predicting long-term benefits of species like stone crayfish and frogs. And who doesn't like a frog either? I mean, we underestimate nature sometimes, Zoe, but there it is. Not just working hand in hand with nature, but they were doing it better than us.
Absolutely. And I think, there has been, when we talk about development and planning, we're talking about construction workers and how we get everything through our system. Maybe we just need to, reintroduce beavers, because apparently they can do it way quicker than we can. And I think it is actually a real testament to nature and making sure that we are keeping an ecological eye on our system, because clearly these systems have existed for hundreds and hundreds and thousands, millions of years, and as much as human progress has been great in some ways, why not just get a load of beavers
this is going to sound like a terribly naive question. Do we have beavers in the UK? We have otters, don't we? Or is it otters we don't have?
I don't think we have beavers, but someone might want to fact check that.
There might be some, yeah.
We had them once, but we don't have them anymore.
See, an otter, they're a bit ridiculous, aren't they, with those little eyes going, oh, look at me, I'm really cute and everything, but come near me, I'll have your face off. They are that kind of...
They're very scary, actually. Yes,
your otter. I have dreams about sort of Hitchcock-like dreams. Forget the birds. The otters are coming. Listen, Zoe, great to have you on again. Thank you for your time. Zoe Greenewald, who is, of course, political journalist and broadcaster with us on the programme. I think we should have some otter/beaver facts as well throughout the course of the programme. 0344 499 1000. That is where you'll find us. Big question we're throwing out: should Reform and the Tories form a coalition? What do you think on that? Oh, apparently I've just been told wild beavers and those in captive release schemes can be found across Britain. In Scotland, beavers have been declared a native species and they enjoy a European protected species status. The largest wild population in Scotland lives in the Tay catchment area and has spread into the River Forth, into the River Forth catchment area. So there you go. There is, I mean, we're happy to bring you beaver news on the hour. That's not a problem at all. We'll have a little different factoid to throw out. But, you know, let's not forget the otter as well. Slimy as it is, we'll throw that in too. 0344 499 1000. Lots to get through. Just gone 1:30. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon.
It's interesting. I was thinking, just as I was saying that, about the Tory party ceasing to be conservative. You've written about that for as long as I can remember, that being central to the problem, of course. But they want success. Reform wants success. Is the only way for the two to get together?
Only way for what? I have indeed been writing about it since almost as long as I can remember, because the thing that I spotted round about the beginning of the Blair era was that there wasn't actually any politically, socially and morally conservative force in this country, even though millions and millions of people have politically, morally and socially Conservative opinions. They were not being represented by the party which campaigned as the Conservative Party. And what I suggested, particularly back in 2010, when it wouldn't have done us really very much harm, when in fact David Cameron was to the left of Gordon Brown, that people should have mass abstained from voting so that they prevented David Cameron's totally liberal Blairite takeover of the Tory party, with which we now live, and which is one of the reasons for the complete mess that we're now in. But nobody's interested in that. And the problem for me is people say, well, okay, well, you could have a reform Tory coalition, say Al Johnson comes back from his Oxfordshire exile and forms a pact with Nigel Farage, and they sweep the country, and whenever it is. But then what do you get? You don't get any conservatism. Conservatism vanished around about the Thatcher-Reagan era in a mass of tax cutting, which isn't particularly conservative, and a constant obsession with damaging foreign interventions, and absolutely no interest at all in the key things which would actually make our society more conservative. The most important one of them all being trying to maintain and support the married family, which is the principal alternative to state power in our society. And there is absolutely no sign in either the Reform or the Conservative Party. Anybody spotted that? You can promise to cut taxes as much as you like, but if you don't strengthen the family, then the state has to expand and expand and expand into the areas the family used to cope with, and it can't afford it. And that's why we have this colossal, vast welfare state, because it's trying to substitute for the family. And until somebody recognises this simple point about politics, that the stable married family is the key to civilized society, and the left hate it, and big business hate it, but people like it, and somebody who stood for it. And the other thing, of course, which has now become very dominant in this part of politics is claims by the supposed new right that it will do something about mass immigration, but it never does. And I don't think, Giorgia Meloni, people are constantly going on about how brilliant she is in Italy, but I don't think she's actually significantly reduced mass immigration into Italy. And if the Alternative for Deutschland manages to propel the German conservatism towards its opinions, and even if Marine Le Pen becomes president of France, I struggle to see how, in the current state of things, they're going to do very much about the fact that an enormous amount of mass immigration has already taken place. And there isn't really anything that any civilized government can do about it, except try and make the best of it. So I don't think there's any real sign. There's an awful lot of noise about it now, and people have begun to realize that the Conservative Party is not conservative, but they haven't, as a result, turned back to a proper conservatism. So I see no hope in it at all.
As you well know better than me, Peter, you've been covering politics and all sorts of connected areas for many, many years. The one thing that your average professional politician likes more than their own political ideology is success at almost any price. So diluting a few policies here and there comes quite easy to some of the Westminster characters. Would that be a factor, do you sense, in this, that, you know, what would have been unthinkable a few years ago, getting into bed with Nigel Farage, and I'm sure Mr Farage will say the same thing, if it means a winning ticket, many of them will do it, and they'll dilute or obliterate everything you've just said about conservatism in order to get it.
Yes, that's how it works. But the problem is, of course, there's another great aspect of this, which is not as secondary as it sounds, and I'm mentioning, which is education. And the great revolution in this country, which got underway in the 1960s, was largely took place in education. And the schools and the universities and our society in general are simply not producing conservatives anymore. People, especially since David Cameron, who stand under the conservative label, don't have conservative opinions. So whatever they may say to the public about what they're going to do, they won't believe in it. This is one of the reasons for the colossal mess over the European Union referendum and what followed it. The Conservative Party didn't believe in the policy it was compelled by the referendum to implement, which is why it made such a complete mess of it. And if they tried to implement conservative policies now, the same thing would happen. But then look again, what is conservative about Nigel Farage, a man who's spoken out in favour of decriminalisation of marijuana, who doesn't seem to me to have any particularly conservative views about any other subject? And why would you imagine that he would rebuild a conservative, stable society of the kind which so many people yearn for? I don't think there's any real sign of it.
But it might win, even if it isn't in the form that you'd ideally like to see it.
Yeah, David Cameron won under a conservative label in this second election that he held. He actually won a majority. And what did that produce? Nothing conservative at all. And indeed, if you're genuinely interested in conservative ideas, if you're me, you look back on the Thatcher period from 1979 to 1990, and you struggle to see a single conservative political measure. This is a woman who knew perfectly well, because she closed a lot of them down, that the closure of the grammar schools, for instance, state grammar schools, had been a disaster. But during all that time in office, sometimes with an enormous majority, she did absolutely two parts of nothing to put it right when she had the power to do so. There are many other aspects of this as well. She did nothing to protect the family, nothing to protect marriage. And she became increasingly preoccupied as well with foreign intervention, as so many prime ministers do. It will produce political change, new faces in Downing Street and in ministries. And the current government, which is so incompetent and so useless, and also so generally directed against almost anything everybody believes in, is so bad that I can easily see a coalition of people who just stand on not being Keir Starmer winning on that basis. And it's I have a combination of a really, really bad building contractor who started fixing your house 10 years ago and never comes to finish it, and somebody who then, when you comes out the street, kicks you in the shins. You would take almost anybody as an alternative to that, and people will take almost anybody as an alternative to that. They can win office, but they'll be in office but not in power, because they don't stand for anything, and fundamentally they're not that different from Keir Starmer, I'm sorry to say.
Do they have to stand for? I largely agree with you, and I think but there's I've sensed there's almost a romantic component to me saying that in an ideal world, wouldn't it be great if it was like that when I grew up as a child of the 70s? That sense of family and tradition and all these wonderful areas of life that have become almost dirty words, or obsolete nonetheless. If I had to redesign life from scratch, Peter, it would look something like that. But I also have to acknowledge that, the world changes. The world becomes smaller. The internet has had an irredeemable effect on how the world and individuals do business, how we opine, how we form relationships. So there is such a thing as a natural evolution, albeit coerced through technology and other perhaps social initiatives, etc. Things do change, whether you or I like it or not.
Well, of course they change, but sometimes they change for the worse, and in which case it's probably a good idea to change them back, or change them in some other way that overcomes the badness that has come into your world. An awful lot of the things you mention have become strong in our lives precisely because of the weakness of private life, the subjection of people to electronic media, the subjection of people to state power and manipulation, the subjection of people to very, very difficult social circumstances in which it's almost impossible for a young person to find a place to live, or to find a secure and stable job that's likely to last him or her any length of time. The terrible situation in which small children are placed, where their parents, much as they love those children, are compelled by economic circumstance to stuff them into nurseries rather than bring them up themselves. The absence of mothers or fathers at home. These things are changes for sure, and many people have got used to them, but they were changes for the worse. And if we don't want to see ourselves go down the plumbing, then we should be doing something to reverse them.
All right, Peter, great to have you on. Always a very thorough, thought-out view from Peter Hitchens. Do you concur? Said it would be impossible, really, because it wouldn't mean anything. Marco Longhi is a former Tory, was a Tory MP, now a spokesman for Reform UK. Marco, good afternoon to you. Peter Hitchens does look at things through a certain set of glasses. I understand that, and I would imagine half an hour ago you'd have probably agreed with Peter.
Well, I couldn't fault Peter at all in anything he said. You talked about things changing, and Peter is right. Things have changed for the worse. There has been a degradation of values across society, within the country, in so many different ways. And, people often use this word progressiveness, and it somehow infers a positive thing is happening, but actually a lot of it, in my book, has resulted in a degradation and now this general malaise that we have various corners of our country, and it's being brought about under the Conservative watch. I would very much want to return to a United Kingdom with its values and principles of 30 or 40 years ago. I can tell you I've not long returned from a visit to the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, and then after that, Japan. And I came back rather angry, really, because I saw streets completely clean, people being extremely respectful, no shouting, queuing up very politely. That used to be the United Kingdom that I was brought up in. But it's completely gone now. It's been completely trashed.
But the point that Peter Hitchens made, though, Marco, sorry to interject, was that you wouldn't get under any of this under Reform either. So putting the two together, Reform and Conservatives, might win something, but it doesn't stand for anything, was his point.
But so much has changed that I suppose many people would be wondering if we've gone beyond that point of no return. You would have to start chipping away. I always say, you know, if you have to climb a mountain, you do it one hill at a time. And a win for Reform, in my opinion, would actually start a process of returning back to what we used to have. I mean, look, Reform Act stands for radical tax cuts, immigration restrictions, doing away with this net zero madness. If you look at the Conservative Party, it has delivered exactly the opposite of that.
But if you want to win, though, Marco, if you want to win the next election, you've got to be in bed with the Tories, haven't you? You've got to be in bed with the Tories.
Vote Reform. More and more people need to vote
That might
Reform.
be true, but how would you overturn all those Labour seats, those delicious red socialist areas of life where you could normally put a red rosette on a donkey and it would get elected? I mean, that's romantically, again, to use that word for a second time, that might look like a possible, it might look doable, but it's unlikely, isn't it? I mean, Keir Starmer's got a thumping majority, weird as that might be. You can't overturn some of those seats.
No, but a huge number of those seats are on wafer-thin majorities. I'm sure the numbers will evidence that. Yeah. And Reform have come second in something like 80 to 90 of those seats.
Yeah, I thought that was actually one of the most interesting parts of the last election, actually. It's those second placings.
And that was in July 24.
Yeah.
Where are we now? We are in, we're in February 2025, and I can tell you, if we had a general election tomorrow, I think we would see.
So you don't think that Reform need the Tories to make it happen?
Well, no, I do not, and I think it would actually be very detrimental because, the Reform is very much seen as an anti-establishment politician. Political party. If it aligns itself with a Conservative Party as it is now, which really is Conservative in name, is full of Liberal Democrats, and certainly Labour, well, we know what Labour stands for. All it does is that it would lose credibility with its own base. Okay. So why would it do that? So it wouldn't do. It should not do that, but it has a moral duty not to do so if it is actually going to make Britain great again.
All right, there is.
And I genuinely believe that we need to win our country back.
Marco, as always, thank you. Great to have you on, sir. Marco Longhi, he's a former Conservative MP, now a spokesman for Reform UK. I think he's ambitious in his thinking there. Your thoughts? Should the Tories and Reform form a coalition? 0344 499 1000. This is Talk.
these Labour MPs, I mean, they're sort of just proving what many people fear.
Yeah.
Just shocking how you can think some of those things, let alone type it.
They used to call the Tories the nasty party. Everybody knows who the nasty people are in politics, and it's the left-wingers. They are the most horrific, ghastly, prejudicial, mean-spirited, bigoted people. They don't. The Labour Party clearly still has a problem.
It's a hard left approach to life, and they're as nasty about and to each other as to everybody else. They're just not very nice people.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Right back with you in just a second. Jules, don't go away. You'll be on first. Just gone 10 to 2 here on Talk. And now time to find out how you could be in with a chance of winning £25,000.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? All you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
There it is. 25 grand. 25 grand. Simple as that. Quick text. John in Gravesend says there's no way there should be a deal with the Tories. The mistake everyone is making is that all Reform voters are ex-Tory. Looking at the polling data since July, although Tories have dropped, it's not by much. The real drop is in Labour, and that is where Reform is getting members from. As an ex-Tory myself, why would I deal with a party I left? And why would ex-Labour voters? Reform will win all by themselves. You're very naive if you think otherwise. Well, with respect, John, and I don't think you've got to be a physiologist of any great nature to work it out, that the numbers at the moment don't fully stack up. There is some seductive polling, I don't dispute that, but I think naive would be the wrong word. I mean, you might say pessimistic. Jules is in Bedford on this same point. Jules, what do you think?
Hi, Ian. Yeah,
Hi.
so just think to Peter Hitchens and his sort of taking the long view of what it means to be a Conservative as going back to the 1970s. I think the point, with respect to his very great knowledge, the point he's missing is the fact that what it means to be a socialist has changed across that same period. So that now socialism is much more about embracing, amongst other things, the supranational bodies, the lack of democratic accountability, which of course is why we voted to leave the EU, and instead is becoming this globalized, do what the World Economic Forum's agenda suggests we should do, and so forth. And it's absolutely right that the antidote to that, conservatism, needs to have evolved at the same time.
It's an interesting point, and the one that I did put to Peter Hitchens, as you will have heard, Jules, is that, things do change and appetites change, and, maybe not always for the good, but you're absolutely right. The things that are priorities today are very different from the ones that were priorities 30 years ago, and that would be the same for all parties, right, for whether you're left-wing or right-wing.
Exactly, and if you look at what Reform is offering, the key elements are a break with that supranationality. So getting out of the European human rights arm lock, for example, getting rid of the climate change act so you're no longer tied to the sort of world agenda of net zero and so on. So these are all returning power to the country. And that, I think, today is what it means to be a Conservative with a small c, which is why a lot of traditional Labour voters would also embrace that, because they have similar priorities in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of horseshoe, the left meets right thing, where there is a synergy there. Yeah, I think you're spot on about that. Jules, great call. Thank you for that. Jules in Bedford. Dave is down in London. What are you thinking, Dave? Hello.
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
No, Reform have to resist this Conservative thing. I know you said that a donkey with a red rosette on it would get in a big Labour-held constituency, but that donkey would get in whether it was Conservative or Reform, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. What about? I mean, you could argue that the Tories, love them or hate them, have got 111 seats there up for grabs that Reform could just take if they did a deal, and then you add on the Reform ones as well. Plus, you'd then get those Conservatives coming over to a more Reform-like idea of things, and if Reform were a bit scatty on inexperience, some of those Conservatives could help out with that. Some might say it's the perfect marriage.
No, I don't rate any of their experiences. They've all got like 31-year experiences. They don't have real experience, so that doesn't cut for anything at all. Hunt was no good as a Chancellor, no better than Rachel from accounts. He wasn't qualified either. They don't have the right experience in. Experience isn't about sitting in a chair for 30 days and staring out the years and staring out the window. It's got to be more than that. And so I just think that what Reform need to do is maybe not yet. They need to start just laying down some of their policies, like raising the income tax to 20%, which Labour are going to be forced to do that soon, getting rid of inheritance tax, and making Britain great again, as your last contributor was saying. That would resonate very well, because Britain and great is in the name. I know it means it should be UK with Northern Ireland, but
no, I get it, and that can happen. Listen, Dave, I have to run just because the news is upon us. Thank you very much indeed for that. Nice reference to Rachel from accounts. I heard somebody trying to construct an argument that phrase in itself is quite sexist, and I was trying to think, of all the satire we've had over the years, 90-odd% of it aimed at male politicians, whether it's Private Eye, Have I Got News for You, or anywhere else for that matter. I think you're on a sticky wicket if you're going to try and construct that particular argument, and see Boris Johnson for details, perhaps. 0344 499 1000. Dan Hodges joins us in the next section. Always a great voice on the big political stories of the day. We're throwing in that question: should Reform and the Tories form some kind of coalition? Is that doable? Our lines are open. Let's get the latest news headlines, though, at 2 o'clock, right here on Talk.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Coming up on 3 minutes after 2 o'clock. Yeah, good afternoon. Welcome back to the home of common sense. What are we looking at here? The Conservatives exploring a potential alliance with Nigel Farage's Reform UK to counter Labour's dominance. Of course, polls show Reform overtaking the Tories. In some polls, overtaking Labour as well. However, it should be said Mr Farage has ruled out any kind of pact vowing to turn or take Britain back to greatness. More comment on that. Should there be a pact between the two? Is that the only way you could guarantee some kind of centre-right success? Is there any other way? Also this afternoon, the Albanian criminal avoided deportation after a tribunal heard or ruled that it would be unduly harsh on his son. One of the reasons, it was reportedly said that his son didn't eat foreign chicken nuggets. So it'd be very cruel to send him back to inferior nugget territory. Nobody wants to go there. The case is part of a record backlog of asylum appeals. It sparked outrage and renewed calls for stricter immigration laws. And farmers have descended on London for the third time in 4 months to protest inheritance tax changes on agriculture land. The reforms, criticised by supermarkets and farming groups, have sparked fears of financial strain, with protesters vowing to haunt the government until those changes are reversed. We'll have more on that as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk. 0344 499 1000. George says, no, Tories cannot be trusted. Reform UK need to go it alone, and they will get there. George in Croydon, thank you. This one from Vicky. We do have beavers in England. A number were rewilded in Plymouth. I actually got a text when we were talking about that from Kevin O'Sullivan, who was kind of incredulous at my lack of beaver-based knowledge. He said, this is just basic, mate, basic. Of course we have beavers. They've been reintroduced all over the country. I've never seen one, to be fair. I'm sure they don't just... You're not going to see one necessarily in Bromley High Street, but I get the point. Thank you to all of our beaver correspondents. Let's get a word with Dan Hodges. From Dan Hodges, commentator, of course, journalist, Mail on Sunday, always has a big view on the big stories of the day. Dan, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
It's funny, isn't it? When you and I first started having kind of, debates, and you joined me on radio shows, I can remember a particular moment, I don't know if you recall this, when we were sat in a studio elsewhere, and it was you and the current leader of UKIP at the time, and it was one of the most uncomfortable moments, I think, in broadcasting history from where I was sat, because neither of you had a word to say to each other, but it was a very dignified debate. I only raise that because it's interesting that now UKIP, who are of course still going, sort of, very much a backseat to what's happening with Reform. Have you ever seen a party or any kind of star rise quite as quickly, love them or hate them, as Nigel Farage's Reform Party?
There are examples. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Greens suddenly came out of nowhere in the 1980s and had this incredible success in the local elections, and there was suddenly a sort of a Green surge, and that faded away. Obviously, we had the SDP Liberal Alliance, and they were told to go back to their constituencies and prepare for government. But I think there is so we do have precedents. But I think you're right. I don't think you can underestimate just how significant the Reform surge is. I mean, I think, to feed into what you were saying at the sort of the top of the programme, this debate about whether or not Reform and the Tories are going to do a deal. Frankly, I'm going to be completely honest. I think at the moment, the more pressing question is, by the time we get to the next election, is there going to be a Tory party left for Reform to do a deal with? The way things are going at the moment, and I know Tory MPs are becoming increasingly concerned about Reform's direction of travel, their own direction of travel, and what's obviously, frankly, what they see as the lacklustre and ineffective leadership of Kemi Badenoch. And I think that's the key to it. I think the reality is there is not going to be any form of deal as long as Kemi Badenoch remains Tory leader. But obviously the question is, how long is she going to remain Tory leader? At the moment, I would not be, putting a lot of money, frankly, on her still being in post in 12 months' time. So I think that's one of the key things we're going to have to keep an eye on.
I mean, there's certain irredeemable realities, I suppose, though, Dan, isn't there? I mean, if you look at voting intention, I know Reform had one of the more interesting parts of the last election was the areas where Reform came second, and that was quite close. And I think that is a big factor in how they will fare in the next election, assuming they continue on this rise that they appear to be enjoying. But there are many more Labour seats that I can't imagine, would turn anything like to Reform should there be an election today or in 10 years' time. But if you look back to when Boris Johnson came into power, we said, look, he's got a nice big majority, 80-odd seats. That's Boris Johnson in Downing Street for 2 terms at least. He's going to be there for 2 terms. Or there's only 2 things that could happen to scupper that. One would be there'd have to be some kind of scandal and he was almost forced out. And 2, you'd have to have, I don't know, something daft like the SNP collapses in Scotland. And good Lord, both of those things happen spectacularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, the polls are overestimating Reform support. Right, if you're asked at the moment, if you're in the street, you're online, the phone rings, you've got a polling company, a pollster says, how are you going to vote if there's an election tomorrow? You've got an electorate that obviously was hugely disillusioned with the Tories, was sick of them after 14 years, is obviously hugely disillusioned with Keir Starmer and Labour because of all the issues we've all talked about since they got into government. It is not surprising that a number of people are going to effectively use a pollster's question as a form of protest and say, I'm going to vote for, plague on both their houses. I'm going to vote for Reform. We will see. Obviously, we've got local elections coming up. I expect Reform to do very well in those local elections. But the reality is, when you get to a general election, you're electing a government. It's a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, there's an opinion poll out today that shows that despite all the disillusionment, Keir Starmer is 10 points ahead of Nigel Farage in the question, who do you think would make the best Prime Minister of the country? So you've got that, you've got the issues with the polling system. Remember, on polling day last year, we had an exit poll which was supposedly was going to give Reform 10 seats. They ended up with 5 because of the way the polling system mitigates against them. Obviously, they don't have the same sort of infrastructure and traditional organisation that the main parties had. So you have to put in all these caveats. Because the main thing is we're still 3.5 years away from the next election, and obviously a lot can happen between then. But that all said, I think the one factor that is really different this time is, as I say, just it's not an implosion. It's the complete ongoing erosion of the Tory vote and the failure of the Tory party and Kemi Badenoch to really do anything significant to start to address all the massive strategic problems that they faced at the last general election. Yeah. I mean, there is one other factor, though. I think, the problem is this simplistic. If there is a Tory-Reform alliance, that will obviously be a way of saving the Tories and boosting Reform. What people forget is there is a significant amount of Reform vote which is actually disaffected Labour voters. So if Nigel Farage was seen to pivot towards the Tories, immediately there are a lot of people saying, hang on a second, that's not, and Labour would immediately pounce on that. Similarly, there are a lot of relatively sort of liberal Tory voters who did stick, held their noses and stuck with the Tories last time. If they see the Tories pivoting towards Reform, they're going to say, no, that's too nuts for me, and just go off to the Lib Dems. So it's complicated, and this is actually why Kemi Badenoch has so many problems at the moment. She you can see it's why she frankly hasn't done anything since she became leader, because she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know whether to pivot towards reform,
correct,
or the extent to which she should pivot towards reform, the extent to which she should sort of pivot to try and get voters back from the Lib Dems, or try and, you know, put forward a new sort of independent Tory agenda.
Let's move to this story, Dan. Who would have, I said this in the last hour, who would have thought in 2025 anybody would find themselves getting collared in the old WhatsApp roost? But here we are again. You know, Matt Hancock's been there, some pretty unsavoury cops over there at Charing Cross Police Station found themselves in the same thing. I think there's been teachers and a few other characters. It seems to be the oldest one in the book these days, but that's exactly what's happened. Not one but two MPs. One has been fired as a minister, whip suspended. There's another one, Oliver Ryan, revealing he was a key member of this WhatsApp group. It was called Trigger Me Timbers, and it was really allegations of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia that's done it here. Some pretty unsavoury stuff going on there. And this comes, of course, from the party, or certainly a couple of members of the party that would, on any other day of the week, would have claimed, oh, no, it's the horrible Tories, right-wingers that do stuff like this, not us nice socialists. Apparently not.
Well, I think, just to begin with, I mean, I do have issues with this scandal, because as a rule, I do think we are becoming a little bit too excessively puritanical in relation to how people conduct themselves in private, on private WhatsApp groups, the nature of discourse, which is not for public consumption, people joking and saying stupid things, which are sort of poor off-collar jokes, but are not what they sort of necessarily believe in. Yeah. So that's is normally my starting point on this sort of stuff. But the problem we have, and you've just touched on it, firstly, there is the nature of some of this, which was racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic, allegedly. This is something that Keir Starmer, firstly, said he was going to be cracking down on. But secondly, as you and your viewers are aware, whenever anybody from another political party or anywhere else on the political spectrum is caught doing this, telling an off-colour joke or something that could be construed as being racist or sexist or homophobic or Islamophobic, the Labour Party are the first to come down hard like a ton of bricks on people and say, you know, drum them out of town. So there's that aspect. Plus, and this is not hindsight, I was saying this for years, even before Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, we had this whole holier-than-thou, pious, I'm going to clear up politics, we're going to be so much better. You know, people like Boris and the Tories, they've lowered the tone of politics. We are going to be completely different. And I was saying at the time, this is going to come back and bite you. Yes. Because you're not that different. And people are going to see you're not that different. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. So I do have some sympathy. I'll be honest.
I agree. I tend to agree with that, Dan. And it was the same really when Keir Starmer, you know, suddenly found himself in about 40 grand's worth of Armani suits or whatever it was. You know, it wasn't the fact, because nothing illegal happened there. If a donor wants to give some money to a party, he can do. But the mood music and everything that Labour stood for was that, you know, we don't even know millionaires. We don't know people like that. That's the old Tories. They know all those characters. No, we're working people. We're working class people, and we only know working class people. All that higher echelon stuff. No, that's the old Conservative way. We are very different, and that's where the line is drawn on this, isn't it? It's that idea that the moral high ground that they spent so long attempting to occupy gets somewhat obliterated by stories like this. And it brings us on to the voice coaching story, which again, similar, I'm sure this is in similar territory. Number 10 refusing to reveal who paid for Starmer's voice coach. I mean, first question is, someone paid for that? Wow, there is that. But secondly, it's likely to be Lord Ali or somebody like that threw a few quid into the pot for this. And again, it's just that look, isn't it? You can imagine how much fun the Labour Party would have had if they discovered Boris Johnson had had speech lessons.
Well, we remember what the Labour Party was saying at the time. They were saying Boris Johnson should resign because he wasn't obeying the rules. Yeah. And I do think you're absolutely right. I think, but you know, there's an element that this is just a bit sort of, you know, it's WhatsApp messages, a little bit of tittle tattle, bit of Westminster froth. But I think it does come back to a more fundamental strategic problem that Labour have got at the moment, which is this: I don't think, if you speak to ministers, advisors, MPs, even they would admit, Labour MPs, Labour ministers, Labour advisors, even they would admit they didn't win the last election because the country was swept away by Keir Starmer and the party and the Labour Party and what their offer was. Yeah. They won the last election because people were sick of the Tories, and they were a little bit sceptical, but they wanted Labour. They wanted to give Labour the chance to show them that they could be different. Now, it's still early days. I understand Labour's inherited a lot of problems from the Tories. And, this idea, everything was wonderful until, Keir Starmer came in and everything then fell apart is just rubbish. I think we've all got longer memories than that. But the point is, as I say, Labour won the last election because the British public were going to give them the chance to show them that they could be different and they could be better. And at the moment, every day we're getting another story which basically is demonstrated to the public that Labour aren't that different and Labour aren't better. And that's the problem that Starmer's got. And that's why stories like this, whilst they may seem sort of part of the whole Westminster gossip mill, and we will move on from this in the next few days, that's the problem for Starmer. He said, vote for me, I'll be different. And the reality is at the moment he isn't.
Yeah. Spot on. Dan, thank you. Great to have you on. We will speak again soon, I hope. Dan Hodges, commentator, of course, journalist with The Mail on Sunday. Thank you to him. Over to you, 0344 499 1000. We're asking that question, should Reform of the Tories form a coalition? There's loads of nuances to this, and it's just, if you are a convert or a new member of Reform UK, as Dan quite rightly pointed out, the fact that you've left the Conservatives would probably seem a bit weird that you might do a coalition with the Conservatives. But of course, you could argue that point as well about some of the former Labour voters that have gone to Reform. I had a guy doing some work on my house last year. In fact, he stood for election for Reform UK. He was a plasterer. And he actually came from the left. He was, the old Tony Benn school of left-wing thinking. Found himself supporting Reform because he found there was more to identify with Reform. So you've got a kind of plethora of issues going on there. If you wanted to look at it in purely electoral success terms, so forget ideology, forget what people stand for fully, because there would still be enough in common between the Tories and Reform. It just wouldn't be in perhaps some of those salient areas. And the Tory party, who failed so spectacularly on so many things, particularly immigration, has got to try and win that trust back. But if you wanted to look at it purely based on if there was an election tomorrow and you put the Tories and Reform together, I don't think those Reform voters would then go, I'm not going to vote Reform now because they've got into bed with the Tories. I think you would get a double bubble of success and they would beat the Labour Party. But the question then becomes, what do they stand for? Peter Hitchens earlier questioned, what do the Tories and Reform stand for ideologically? What are they really in terms of right-wing conservative thinking? 0344 499 1000. We'll go back to your calls in just a couple of moments. This is Talk.
these Labour MPs, I mean, they're sort of just proving what many people fear.
Yeah.
Just shocking how you can think some of those things, let alone type it.
They used to call the Tories the nasty party. Everybody knows who the nasty people are in politics, and it's the left-wingers. They are the most horrific, ghastly, prejudicial, mean-spirited, bigoted people. They don't. The Labour Party clearly still has a problem.
It's a hard left approach to life, and they're as nasty about and to each other as to everybody else. They're just not very nice people.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Just to give you the latest as well on that breaking news, armed police have raced to an area of Lewisham in South London after somebody dressed in a dressing gown clad man was seen shouting and brandishing a knife outside a window. Officers holding firearms placed the South East London High Street under lockdown this morning amid fears of a hostage situation. Now, the incident is still ongoing. Police said they are speaking to the man standing there and trying to work out if anyone else is in the property. So it's ongoing. That's, of course, a pivotal bit of detail as to how they will be dealing with this. And as we get more, we'll bring it to you here first on Talk. 24 minutes after 2. Phil is in Hertfordshire. How are you doing, Phil?
Good afternoon, Ian. Yes.
Afternoon. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are this. Let's remember this, which is coming up. 5.5 million votes are going to be basically disregarded in these by-elections coming up. And remember, Conservatives have colluded with Labour to make that happen. They are absolutely running scared of reform. They are, I can't say how much they're scared of them, or else they wouldn't be doing it.
You're spot on. I think they are terrified of what's going to happen. But what do they have to do then? Become a bit more reformy?
Well, I don't think they can, Ian. I think they've blown it.
Yeah.
Because the Labour, he lied and lied and lied. Many people were quite rightly cheesed off with the Conservatives. Reform was a very new party. However, they thought, you know what, let's go for Labour. Starmer has sold it to us. Mm-hmm. What he did, he gaslit the nation. And people remember that. And since they've been in power, all they've done is make it worse for themselves. They just keep putting nails in the coffin. Every week there's another nail, another nail. And I really do believe that this 5.5 million votes, they've just basically wiped them off. And the Conservatives jumping on board with it, I think is still their fate, and the Conservatives, because there are people that left the Conservative, voted Labour for that reason, and now they think, well, hang about, you just jumped into bed with them.
Do they just need if they had a different leader, though, Phil, than Kemi Badenoch, would that make a difference? Somebody who, the trouble is with politics today is, they often talk about politics as show business for ugly people, but you've got to have some kind of show business about you. I don't know how Starmer's managed to do it. Farage, like a Trump character, has that showbiz, right? He has that panache. He has that magnetism. He's mesmeric. People look at him and go, well, I might disagree with him, but I want to listen to him.
Well, I think we've had too much of that in the past, Ian, with Boris Johnson. He was full of charisma. He was charismatic. But look what ending happened to the Conservatives. They just went liberal and they went woke. And I really think people have just had enough.
Yeah.
We're fed up being gaslit. We're fed up being lied to. And I believe that a party like Reform and Nigel Farage, they speak and tell you as it is. And that's what the nation wants. We want to know what is real, what is going to happen, not what could be, what not might be, what we could. And if you listen to the words that these politicians use, it's always could, should. Well, that means nothing.
Yep.
You either do or you don't. That's it.
Fair point. Phil, great call. Thank you. Straight to the point. Norman is in Dartford on this same point. Norman, what do you got for us? Hi.
Afternoon, Ian.
Afternoon.
Well, I've now followed politics for 60 years, and I have never known a time when both major parties were so unpopular.
Yeah.
Ever. And this reform movement, it is now the time. There'll never be a time for a long time, and if it doesn't happen now, but if reform go near the Tories, they're finished.
Yep.
There'll be no identity to reform. There'll just be everybody like me who's been a Tory voter for years. Say, well, you're no better than they are.
What if some might say, if you wanted to be generous about this, Norman, it'll be a boot up the backside of the Tory party to somebody to shake them up and go, can you start being Conservative? Because if you can, then we might be able to see some evidence of that, and the evidence we will get is if you form a coalition with Reform. I mean, it's not as if, I know people will say, they're no better than Labour. But Labour supporters look at the Tories like some mad right-wing party, as if Marine Le Pen is running the show.
Well, the thing is, if you voted Tory, you've voted them, and they keep saying the same thing, and they don't do it.
Yep.
And this is what's gone wrong with them. And now these people are not Conservative. I don't know what they are. They have their own sort of little way of in the bubble they live in. They don't live in the real world. And now Labour have proved themselves to be what I always thought. I thought Starmer was the biggest waste of time there's ever been in politics, personally. But
what are we looking for?
As they are Reform, I think they could pull it off. I really do.
You see, many people, Peter Hitchens earlier was saying he also doesn't know what Reform stands for. He knows they talk a good talk and they talk about, claptrap and nonsense and bureaucracy and getting rid of red tape and sorting out immigration. But at their very core, Hitchens' point, Norm, was that he doesn't really know who they are either.
No, but politics have changed. The trouble when you hear people like Peter Hitchens and all that, they've been grown up and they only listen to what they've already heard so many times.
Sure.
Politics is now personalities.
Yeah.
They don't have to be, we will do this specifically and we will do that. You have to sell a movement and an idea. That's what you do in politics now.
Yeah, well, they talk. Yeah, I mean,
the Labour Party and the left-wing bit. I've lived through all that lot.
Sure. It's interesting. I didn't get a chance to pursue it with Peter Hitchens. I don't know if you heard it, Norman, but he said that he thought David Cameron was to the left of Gordon Brown. Now, he might have just been making a smart comment, saying, look,
I think with Cameron, that was the beginning of the end of the Tory party.
Yeah, I think you might. Well, their thinking was the only way to get in is to be a bit blairy. Being a bit blairy was exactly what they did. It even had the dynamic duo in him and Osborne, sort of trying to copy the Blair-Brown thing. Interesting. Norman, thank you very much indeed for that. 0344 499 1000. We'll continue to take more calls from you in the next section. We're also going to be talking about farmers. We're going to talk to William Taylor, of course, what is happening with the farmers' protest. Yet again, these are people, a proud industry, a proud tradition, proud families that are being challenged by this Labour government. And we'll get the latest on what is happening as tractors are set to flood London in the second rally against Rachel Reeves's budget decisions. Details on the way. 0344 499 1000.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
More comment coming in from you. Richard says, every member of the Reform Party I've spoken to would rip up their memberships if they went in with the Tories, including me, says Richard in Cambridge. Now, I find that genuinely fascinating, and I don't think for one second that Richard is wrong in that assessment. What I do find interesting, how far or how much the Tories got it so wrong in the eyes of the electorate. Is that really just on, is it just on immigration? Is it a lot of the net zero stuff? You have to remember that much of this, so many of these areas, I was thinking about that, the Renters Reform Bill, and Ed Miliband going all evangelical and stereotypical on landlords. You know, they're all pirates of bricks and mortar. They rip people off. They don't care if there's no windows or a roof on their property. All this kind of hogwash. Of course, there's some ropey landlords out there, and I'd throw the book at them and put them in jail, frankly. But all of that stuff was probably going to come in had the Tories won the last election. And the net zero stuff, you know, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, the Tories were a little more, they were a bit lukewarm to the net zero stuff. They were broadly on board with it, no more so than Boris Johnson. I mean, Johnson was absolutely... Boris Johnson was on... I don't know how anybody fell for the Boris Johnson stuff, by the way. He was never really a Brexiteer. There was nothing in his backstory to say that this was a man who fundamentally, philosophically, was wedded to the idea of getting us out the EU. He'd never made any noises about this stuff before it became a live issue. So that wouldn't have been true. He was very pro-immigration. Remember, as Mayor of London, he wanted an amnesty for illegal immigrants. That was one of those areas he would like to have followed. He was never carved at. No one ever thought of Boris Johnson as a right-winger. That's how I mean, remember, this is Boris Johnson. He was the Mayor of London twice, one of the most kind of liberal, usually left-wing cities on planet Earth. And he got the big job not once, but twice. There's a reason for that. So, on issues such as immigration, on issues such as the EU, on an issue such as net zero, Boris Johnson would have absolutely been in the same position as Labour. And of course, had he still been Prime Minister, or had he still been the leader of the party, he'd be arguing against it and saying, well, I would have done it slightly differently and all the rest of it. Well, not really. So I think it's that why Richard makes that comment, because the distrust of the Tories is really articulated in what I think I just said there. And Kemi Badenoch, I actually thought Kemi would be really good for the party ages ago when they talked about needing a different leader. I thought she'd be good as a woman and a black woman. I thought they were factors that were relevant to this battle that the Tories had. She was bright enough, had some experience in government. As it turns out, she's just not very good. She's just a bit kind of awkwardy and doesn't have that panache. I've known Nigel Farage for years. If you met Nigel Farage, I'll tell you what's interesting. The last time I saw Nigel, I was at a do, and I went out and had a cigarette outside with him. And as we were sitting out there chatting, just chewing the fat of the day, various people walked past. Right, Nigel, you know, his instantaneous way of stopping and talking to people is, you have to see it to really go, wow, that is a skill. There's a real skill there. A real sense of, you know, I can connect with you immediately. Now, if I was outside, I wouldn't be having a cigarette with Kemi Badenoch, that's for sure. If I was outside, I would imagine she would be all over the place at a moment. Wouldn't quite know what to say, slightly sort of mumbling. You need a showman to run your party these days. And I hate to say that, but you kind of do. You've got to have the bricks and mortar to back it up, but you need a showman there. Sophie is in Essex. What have you got for us, Sophie? Good afternoon.
So I'm a Reform UK member, and I actually stood in the last general election as a candidate for Thurrock. And I can tell you, unequivocally, that we would lose so much support, mine included, if we got into bed with the Conservatives. The feeling down in Thurrock about that is so strong, and I would fight tooth and nail against it.
What is it I mean, it is the Tories. It's not the Greens we're talking about here. It's the Tories, for goodness sake. How have they made themselves so well, maybe not so instantaneously, but fairly rapid rate So, like, you know, but when Reform members like yourself and Richard, the text, when you speak of them, it's almost as if we're talking about, you know, getting in bed with the Socialists or the Green Party.
No, absolutely, and I get what you're saying. But I was just listening to the piece that you were doing just a minute ago, and Kemi Badenoch, she's so wishy-washy. I mean, she's not holding him to account. You're absolutely right. Nigel Farage is a fantastic orator, and he knows his stuff. I know I've got to know him quite well now, and he's what you see on the camera is what you see behind the camera. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. But he's just, anybody can go up and talk to him. He's very approachable, but he's passionate and he knows his stuff. Our 5 MPs have been holding this disastrous government to account way more than anything I've seen from the Conservatives.
I tell you what, Rupert Lowe should be debated, just him on his own. In terms of, students of politics should be writing dissertations on Rupert Lowe, frankly. I mean, talk about punching above your position, and I mean that kindly. 5 MPs only recently got there. I hear more from Rupert than I hear from Kemi Badenoch.
No, absolutely. And I mean, there's a table that's come out recently that's basically shown the MPs that have sort of submitted the most work and been the most vocal, and Rupert is 5th, and one of our other MPs, James McMurdoch, who came from nowhere, I think is Rupert's 2nd, and I think James is 5th or 6th. So
who was first on that list? Can you remember?
Oh, it was somebody I hadn't heard of, actually.
Like a Labour MP or something?
Labour. No, it wasn't Labour. It wasn't Conservative. I don't have that. I should have that information to hand. I do apologise, but it was.
No, not at all. No. I threw that on you. I was just intrigued as to, because I do remember when I used to be in the press gallery, Sophie, at Westminster, some of the best stuff you would get. You know, you'd be sitting there, and all these kind of, you know, journalists from the world, the media, the Telegraph, the Times, everyone would be there, and an MP at the back would stand up, and you'd hear people in the press gallery go, "Who's that? Who is that?" And you'd get some fairly anonymous character who was really good. And I like that I don't care what party they're from. Someone who does their work for their constituents.
Absolutely.
That's democracy, right? And I think
Jim Shannon, DUP.
DUP, there you go. So not so far away from some of the ideological thinkings, perhaps, of Reform. I don't know.
Really mild. Yeah. But Rupert is 2nd, and James is on the list as well, and he's doing a fantastic job. You know, he's not a career politician like myself. He was just a bit disillusioned with everything, and wanted to get involved.
Well, also the other thing, and I say this kindly. You know, Richard Tice, independent, successful businessman. Nigel Farage, if Nigel didn't work tomorrow, he wouldn't be short of a few quid. He could make it work. Rupert Lowe, incredible career in business prior to that. Doesn't need the job, if you want to look at it that way. There's something about politicians that don't need to be there financially or career-wise that I think is quite attractive to many people.
100%. Rupert Lowe actually donates his entire MP salary every single month to a different charity in Great Yarmouth. They are so lucky to have him up there. What he does up there, the work he does is just phenomenal. And if you look at the front bench of this government that we've got at the moment, I think only one of them has got any actual business experience. How can you run a country if you can't run a business? How can you do that if you haven't had to lay out?
I find it. I mean, I know. Look, you know, you need all sorts of different types. But you're right. In fact, who's the one that does have you've dropped that one on me there, Sophie? Who's the one that does have some business experience?
Again, you've held me to account.
I keep doing this, don't I? Yeah. You'll never call again after this. But you're right. I mean, I look at that front bench and I think, imagine having never seriously worked in the commercial sector in any kind of significant position, if you like, even if you didn't own the company, just somewhere in business where you know the nuts and bolts.
No, absolutely. And I've always said this, even before I started getting involved in politics. I've always said that we should have more people who can have the ability to run businesses, have had to look at a balance sheet, maybe lay awake at night wondering how they pay the staff on Friday. I thought I was going to lose everything through the pandemic. I had to really box clever for 2 years. And I spent 2 years robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Good for you.
I haven't got a huge business. I've got a very small business, but I have had it for nearly 23 years now, and I started it with £300 to my name and no prior business experience, and I built it up from nothing. And I'm really proud of that. And I brought it through a pandemic and a recession and all the other gumps that you have to go through. And none of these career politicians have had to do that.
Sure. It's a fair point. Listen, great to have you on. Oh, by the way, are you looking forward to the local elections in Thurrock?
My goodness, it's so exciting. And can I just say that we have the most outstanding candidate. He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant.
We will watch with interest. We know what's going to happen this year. Listen, Sophie, thank you very much indeed for that. Sophie in Essex, active with Reform UK. This one comes in from Barry. Let Reform and the Tories agree to a pact as long as Reform get the top jobs. They are in ascendancy. Let the Tories have the scraps, says Barry. I mean, that would be the big battle, wouldn't it? I don't even think Kemi Badenoch would get a position in that, but it would only happen. I don't know what you'd call it. Would it be the reforming Conservatives? Would it be the new Conservatives? Would you keep the word reform? Is the word Conservative too toxic? I tell you what, you'd find political marketing people around the planet that would go, no, that the Conservatives is one of the most valuable names in politics. I'm not sure that holds water anymore. This one from Sally. No, Reform shouldn't do a deal with the Conservatives. The Tories are just trying to save themselves and their seats. Reform came second in a good number of those seats, including my area. This Labour government got voted in based on lies and disastrous shock policies and governance since. I'm sure if there was another election now, Reform would win a lot of those seats. I also think people would be more motivated to go and vote. Sally, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll talk farmers in just a second. We're live down there in London to see what that latest protest is all about and how it's going. Stand by for that. Our lines are open. The voice of doom is on its way as well. Day 2 of that. 0344 499 1000.
Case centred on the son's additional needs, although there was no evidence from a trained psychologist, nothing at all. There was evidence from a neighbour and a trainee psychologist. No diagnosis of special educational needs, but basically he had he had problems with socks. He had problems with types of food he would eat, including chicken nuggets, and that was like the only sole example given. And this guy was allowed to stay in the country. I mean, I'd like to think this is unbelievable, but I have a funny feeling this is what happens every day.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk 0344 499 1000. So let's get an overview of what has been happening down there in London. Farmers have taken to the streets for, I think it's the third time in around about 4 months, protesting on those inheritance tax changes on agricultural land. The reforms, which impose a 20% tax on farms worth over £1 million, have drawn criticism from farming groups, support from the supermarkets on this as well. Politicians too, amid warnings of risks to the UK food supply chain. Let's speak with William Taylor, spokesperson for Farmers for Action. William, good afternoon to you. Nice to have you back with us as well. Just explain, if you could then, is this simply about more pressure, the same thing, or is there anything new to what you guys are doing today?
Well, absolutely. Today there is a debate in Parliament buildings in connection with the petition that went in. So today's protest was to coincide with that. And of course we have to keep the pressure up until the Chancellor sees reason and Keir Starmer's Labour government. Because as Donald Trump's son said, why would you persecute farmers? They get up early in the morning, they work 24/7, and they provide the basic essentials for life, of which everybody else in the food chain lives on from there up. So, you know, this is wrong to expect farmers, when they are already getting poor farm gate prices, to then be burdened with a tax that they can't pay. And that's exactly where we are, and we intend to keep the pressure up.
Just give us an idea, if you can, William, how many farmers will this affect?
Look, the way it's going, in Northern Ireland we have it clear that it'll be at least 50% of the farmers. In England it may be slightly less than that, but that's, you know, England, Scotland and Wales. These are figures that, you know, it's going to lose a whole generation of farmers, just like it did in the US until Donald Trump stopped it whenever he came into office the first time. The Democrats had 50% tax imposed on farmers. They lost a whole generation, and the corporates come in and bought the land. So everyone out there will know what they're going to pay for food when that happens. So we intend to see that it doesn't happen.
And in terms of voices that are listening to you in Parliament, now obviously the one that really matters is that of the government. Is there any, I mean, often you hear rumbles and, you know, little words on the street, as it were, that there might be a turning point, there could be a softening of this. Is there anything that you're hearing that would appease what you're trying to get here?
Well, look, I coordinate Fairness for Farmers in Europe, actually, which is all the groups here today put together, and we have requested a meeting with the Chancellor. The first request went in on the 10th of December, just ahead of the last protest on the 11th. Then we heard nothing over Christmas. She didn't reply, so we gave the Christmas holidays. We gave into January. We sent another request. Still no reply. And then again, we sent another request just last week. So 3 times now we've asked for a meeting. Now, this is not to browbeat the Chancellor. We have a proposal to set aside the inheritance tax and put in place legislation on farm gate prices, and the UK will flourish. Because remember, agriculture and the food industry is the biggest industry in the UK by tonnage by far. 50-something% of all the vehicles on the road are carrying food.
And in terms of the fallout, I mean, you talk about the numbers in Northern Ireland, 50% affected. Give us an idea, if you can, William, just articulate what it would mean to the UK if we lost farms at the kind of rate that you're suggesting here. What would happen here? I noticed, by the way, in asking that question, you have a lot of support from the supermarkets.
Well, look, the bottom line is we have the pressure from the supermarkets. That's historic, and everybody knows all about that, down through the food chain to the farmers. But the bottom line is we're losing, I think, current figures, 2% of the farmers across the UK per annum. So 5 twos is 10. In 5 years, we've lost 10%, and you can work out the maths from there up. Yep. And on top of that, The climate secretary is just after taking 7,000 acres out of production to put solar panels on some of the best land in the UK. So you can multiply up the figures, and we're already only 50-something% food self-sufficiency. So in the dangerous world that we live in, you know, food security has to be respected and has to be top of the agenda, and we have to start looking after our farmers and not persecuting them.
William, we will watch with interest. Thank you. Keep up the momentum down there, because it's only by, of course, you know, having a presence. If you say nothing and just run away and just moan every now and again to people like me, it does nothing. But turning up there en masse with tractors and making some noise right in the shadow of Parliament may not instantaneously result in a change of policy, but it could be the beginnings of where governments begin to soften. This one is particularly ridiculous for so many reasons. I hardly need to outline them. It's nothing to do with farmers not paying their fair share. That version of events which gets thrown out mostly by the left, in the same way that they say about private schools and VAT. It's about rich people not wanting to pay their fair share, when in fact they are not only paying their fair share, specifically on education, they're not even using what they're paying for. So those daft arguments don't hold any water. They're just tribal, kind of silly, sixth form points of debate that are used against areas, you know, where there is a perception that all these people are rather well off. You know, it's kind of in that sort of department. So parts of anti-Semitism work in a similar way, of course. You know, all this lot are doing just well. The private school kid, the farmers, etc. You know, it's nonsense and hogwash, and takes into account no intelligent arguments that are part and parcel of this. Let's watch with interest. Let's hope the government renege on this. But sadly, as we always seem to say, don't hold your breath. You never know. Right, very quickly, the voice of doom. This is day 2 of a voice. Look, I promise you, I don't even know the answer to this. So when I hear this voice, I do not know the answer. This is the mystery voice bit with a political angle. It's always a political voice of some sort. Here's the voice.
Closest possible relationship.
Who is that? Don't call in, by the way, because there ain't no prize. But you can message in if you fancy having a crack at it. 87222. Here it is again.
Closest possible relationship.
God, you know when you think, I know that, I know it, I just can't work it out. If we get a correct answer, we will tell you on the other side of the news. If we don't, it rolls over to tomorrow for day 3. Here it is again.
Closest possible relationship.
I haven't got a Scooby-Doo, mate. I do not know. I do not know. But if you think you do, 87222. Hopefully details on the other side of the news. Back to your calls. William in Northamptonshire on farmers. William, what is your take on this? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Well, I think the farmers are making drawing attention to this inheritance tax change. But I think any unincorporated business is at risk, because the inheritance tax is liable on intangible assets, which would cover copyrights, patents, trademarks, goodwill, R&D. So basically, if you have a family-owned business or privately owned business and a partner dies, the business has got to be valued, and let's say the value is worked out at 10 times or 20 times its annual income, and you've got to find 40% of that.
Yeah.
You've just sunk an awful lot of businesses.
But you've got to find 40% of it for something you weren't intending on selling, because you were merely inheriting it in order to continue the business.
The business, exactly. It's a business asset. It's not a private asset.
That's the distinction.
Yes. Then you've got to tell some of your employees, if you have employees, I'm very sorry, but I've got to sell 20% of the business. Or if the business is a sort of single unit made up of goodwill, patents, royalties, trademarks, or whatever, you've got to sell the whole thing as an entity. Now, I think this is an interesting ploy by the government to get a lot of brand names and trademarks onto the market for them to be snapped up by big corporate.
Well, I do hear that. I mean, some write that off as a bit of a conspiracy theory, but I certainly hear that. Listen, William, thank you for that. Great call. 0344 499 1000. We'll take more of that on the other side of the news. And will we get an answer to the voice of doom? Have another listen.
Closest possible relationship.
I have no idea who that is, but maybe you do. And if you do, and you think you know, 87222, there ain't no prize, by the way. We're not giving anything away here. And we've got 25,000 quid being given away in another part of the programme. But if you know the answer, we'll reveal all if we get a correct one on the other side of the news at 3 o'clock. Let's get those headlines now.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Home of Common Sense, 3 minutes after 3 o'clock. So the Tories are apparently exploring a potential alliance with Nigel Farage's Reform UK to counter Labour's dominance. Polls show Reform overtaking the Tories, some of those polls overtaking Labour as well. However, Mr Farage has ruled out any kind of pact, vowing instead to return Britain to greatness. He doesn't need those pesky Tories to do that. Would you support a pact between the two parties? We'll continue to look at that. Also this afternoon, an Albanian criminal avoided deportation after a tribunal ruled it would be unduly harsh on his son. And one of the reasons for that is because apparently the son refuses to eat foreign chicken nuggets. She can't be sending him back to Albania, wherever it was, because the quality of the nugget apparently ain't so good over there. The case is part of a record backlog of asylum appeals. It sparked a bit of outrage and renewed calls for stricter immigration laws, as you might reasonably imagine. And also a survey reveals only 41% of Generation Z are proud to be British, compared to 80% 2 decades ago, with concern over racism, distrust of institutions and a reluctance to defend the nation in conflict. This is senior figures have called the findings a wake-up call for rebuilding national unity. That's a phrase that doesn't really mean anything at all, frankly. It's a nice platitude to wheel out there. Can we get back to basics on the patriotic front? Or should that be the patriotic front? We'll have more on that a little later as well. Everything you need to know, all the breaking news right here on Talk 0344 499 1000. So, before the news, it was the Voice of Doom, as we call it, the political mystery voice bit, where we've been playing you. It's day 2, it was a rollover. This is the voice we've been playing you.
Closest possible relationship.
Do you know who that is? Do you have any idea who that is? Can we hear it again?
Closest possible relationship.
In fact, by the way, we've got Robert Bates with us, our next guest. He's a research director at the Centre for Migration Control, but I think it's fair to say, Robert, a bit of a political anorak as well.
Do you know I wouldn't go that far, but
I'd go
assume he's talking about Brexit. Someone involved in the Brexit debates, closest possible. Might be proved wrong.
OK, well, here's what I can tell you. We have got a right answer. It's not Matt Hancock, it's not Lord Frost, George Osborne, Dominic Raab, these were some of the guesses. Rishi Sunak, no. Darren Jones, no. But Chris Davis was the first person through with a correct answer. It was actually Joe Johnson, as in Boris's brother. He's a really lovely guy, Joe Johnson, former MP for Orpington.
That's the one, yeah. Universities minister as well, wasn't he?
He was universities minister.
Yes, the ever closest relationship.
And married to a Guardian journalist, which is always rather interesting for a Conservative. But there we go. Well done to Chris. It was Joe Johnson. Why is Robert Bates with us in the studio? Well, you've guessed it. We're talking about the. There's lots to talk about here, but particularly that Albanian criminal allowed to stay in Britain in part because his son doesn't like foreign chicken nuggets. Apparently, makes him go all funny. Doesn't like. I don't know what they do over there in Albania. And here's the thing, Robert. I would guess. I think Albania have McDonald's.
Yeah, you'd think McDonald's, same recipe, just copy and paste it across the globe, wouldn't
it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, maybe the vibe's not quite the right, although something with the tomato ketchup, I'd imagine.
But then, you know, the Bird's Eye people, I'm sure they make nuggets. They probably, I would imagine, export to.
But it's clearly a big enough difference for this individual to be able to stay in the country. It's clearly a big enough difference for real concerns to be raised. So who are we to doubt this chap's taste buds?
Yeah, well, they said, I mean, apparently the serious side of it is food sensitivities. I mean, it's Albania we're talking about.
No, well, this is exactly the problem. It's pretty much we have at the moment an immigration tribunal system that will feast upon anything that is presented to them that would allow them to concoct some form of argument that these individuals will in any way suffer by being returned to their home country. We recently released a report of an individual that we couldn't detain and deport despite him being a career criminal, 15 convictions, because his daughter had gender identity issues. So these are the kind of cases that you hear a lot about whilst you actually study the cases going through the immigration tribunal. And the problem is because these tribunals are staffed and led by left-wing lawyers that have kind of graduated to the position of immigration judge. You know for a fact that the person presiding over these cases is coming at each and every single one with a certain worldview. They're very much in these circles of, you know, these left-wing law courts, these left-wing law firms, all these kind of, you know, networks that do exist. So there isn't really any surprise, frankly, that these kind of cases are coming to the fore.
And I think this has become so entrenched that the kind of people that would support this, and you know that there are adults out there that lurk among us who would probably come on a show like this and explain why it was right to make this decision. It's not as if I used to think these are just idiots, you know, half-wits and morons who've kind of decided to subscribe to this kind of weird bullet point list of insanity and have almost sat there in bed rehearsing it. I think it's gone beyond that. I think it's so entrenched they actually believe this stuff.
I think
they genuinely have a world view of it.
They've concocted a whole world view for themselves that almost exists in parallel to reality. These are individuals that clearly spend every waking moment reading over human rights law and, you know, discussing with one another human rights law and the ins and outs of it. And that is really part of the problem, in that we have a whole professional class of people, left-wing lawyers, immigration lawyers, involved in this line of work that are just obsessed with it, and obviously it helps them to be able to expand the remit of that human rights, certain things, you know, being dragged into what needs to be considered, and it really emboldens and aggrandises their own stature. And I think we have to have a real conversation about whether the current system of immigration tribunals are working, whether it really does make sense to have former left-wing lawyers presiding over these cases, or whether we'd be much better placed to have something akin to a jury on these kind of instances, whereas the British public are, you know, 3 or 9 individuals are able to actually pass more common sense judgment.
I'm glad you made that point, because I like a left-wing lawyer, and I'll tell you why I like a left-wing lawyer. Firstly, it reminds me I'm in a democracy.
And it's good copy as well, isn't it, when we come up with this kind of nonsense.
Absolutely. So they provide a lot of material. A left-wing lawyer is fine. A left-wing judge is not fine, and that's the problem, isn't it? Because I want somebody to go, yeah, I'm going to argue the case for this person. I'm going to use everything I can in the book. If anyone's ever sat in a courtroom, you know, you hear a defence lawyer stand up, and sometimes you think, wow, you know, well, but maybe this guy isn't guilty after all. They're very good, you know. And we should be able to test the law to its nth degree. I get that, but I also want a judge that's going to sit there and say, I've heard I was with you all the way, left-wing lawyer, until you introduced the nugget clause, and then frankly you lost the room. Case dismissed, get out, and by the way, the 747's parked in the car park.
Well, frankly, the human rights law and legal framework almost exists parallel and on top of actual law, what we'd consider normal law. It's a kind of construct that's been, you know, embellished in the last 20 or so years. So you'd find that those lawyers, those left-wing lawyers that you refer to, are in many ways making it up as they go along, and they're presenting their case to a left-wing judge who is very akin to go along with those arguments, probably because they're in the same social circles and they go for dinner once a week with one another as well. So we have to realise that the human rights kind of experiment has gone way out of hand, and it's something I truly believe will be obsolete in 20 years' time. I just think it's now running up so far against common sense, it's running up against reality to such a massive degree that we can't carry on like this. And, you know, discussion is thankfully going on about our relationship with the ECHR. We need to do more to talk about whether we need to keep the Human Rights Act. We don't.
Is this ECHR led then, like a case such as this? I mean, I would imagine what probably happened in reality. They said, my child has, you know, some form of neurodiversity, and that neurodiversity manifests in food. For example, you know, even a chicken nugget they can't eat unless it's a certain type. You don't even get that in Albania. It would have been something like that, I guess, which is still, frankly, not a reason for a bad person to remain in the country. I'm sorry, that's not our problem, and it's not the problem of the judiciary or the government, and God knows how much money is spent on these kind of cases. But nonetheless, when they argue these cases, are they utilising the ECHR here?
Well, unfortunately, because this is a lower tribunal, we can't actually read the ins and outs of the details, but it wouldn't take a genius to work out that I would imagine Article 8 of the ECHR, the right to family life, has been evoked to some degree in this particular case. And of course, these articles of the ECHR are so broad. The right to family life, what does that actually compose of? It's so nebulous in idea. Well, exactly. I was about to point out, you know, during the Brexit debates, there was one that was raised many, many times because it's something that can be just endlessly extended to encompass anything. You know,
anything
if you
you
have
like.
you have a car parked in your driveway that you've had for 3 years. That's, you know, probably a part of your family at that point as well. And this is the kind of thing that I think immigration lawyers in particular like to play with. They like to push those limits, and they like to be imaginative and to try and experiment with what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, unfortunately, it has real-world consequences in that this individual will now be staying in the country. Of course, there's another case that's come out in the last hour of a paedophile that's being kept in the country. We're unable to remove this paedophile because, again, he has a right to family life. He has children in the country, and they'd be adversely affected by his removal. So
but that's a sex offender.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, you know, he's got so many rights. He's got probably very well-funded, probably at our expense with legal aid to some degree as well, lawyers who are prepared to take those experiments, make those kind of thought programmes take place, and to figure out that actually we could probably argue he has a right to family life in this case.
Bonkers,
and it trumps, honestly, it trumps British safety, it trumps, you know, the well-being of the nation. It trumps basically, actually, do we respect our own laws and common sense and decency?
And talking of Trumps, I mean, people often, these left-wing lot, scratch their head and go, how did Donald Trump get elected? Because of stuff like this, because of this kind of nonsense where Trump stood up and, OK, not specifically about the chicken nuggets, but he was on that, you know, the insanity, the upside-down nature of the world we're in, common sense approach where no one with a scintilla of intelligence would look at those stories. I mean, the paedophile is a far more compelling example, and say he has a right to a family. He's a paedophile? and he's got a right to a family. Sorry, this is nonsense. Get him out.
So human rights law at the moment is only actually still holding on because it's entrenched, because it's the legal system. It's not there because it has the backing of the population. The British public don't look at these laws and these processes and think, thank goodness that's there. It is only there at the moment because Tony Blair and then the Conservatives did nothing to actually remove it. So I think it's encouraging. The more you hear about how ridiculous these cases are and how far removed from actually serving the interests of the public these cases are and these judges are, we will inevitably have a backlash. And that's why, as I said, I don't think that the human rights kind of edifice has more than 20 years left, because we will eventually end up with some champion figure that is able to say quite clearly, this isn't working for us, this has to go. Who does this actually benefit?
Here's a weird headline, though, in terms of what's happening in the world of illegal immigration, Robert. Is it possible that Labour are doing better at getting the wrong people, illegal people, out of the country, doing better than the Conservatives were? Because they are bragging at the moment, and I think I'm right in saying there's more data to come later as well on their position. Nearly 4,000 illegal workers were arrested in raids, car washes, nail bars, restaurants since Labour came to power. January saw a record 609 arrests, 828 raids. That's a 38% rise in enforcement compared to the previous year. Is Home Secretary Yvette Cooper doing what the others couldn't?
Well, she's doing slightly better than the Conservatives, but I really don't know.
The bar was very low.
Well, exactly. I don't know if that's any praise at all.
True.
The fact of the matter is, the numbers you were reading out there, 609, a couple of thousand here, a couple of thousand there. We have around about 1.2 million illegal immigrants in this country. Not all have come across on small boats, of course. Some have overstayed visas, but when pushed on this issue, Labour politicians seem unwilling or unable to provide an answer about what their plan actually is to deal with that huge problem. It's all very well and good talking about these few thousand that they have managed to deport. Most of them were voluntary deportations where the individuals have agreed to be removed to their home country. It's when you get to those people that are insistent that they have a right to stay in the country or have built, as we said before, a family life here and will therefore fight tooth and nail to stay in the country, that they actually will run up against problems. And of course we also have the issue that many countries won't allow us to return their own nationals to their country. So we have many countries, especially in South Asia, who will simply say, sorry guys, that chap entered your country illegally, we're not taking him back, it's your problem to deal with now. And Labour haven't got an answer to any of those questions.
Even if you had, let's say Reform UK were running the show, they are the most outspoken and have intentions to be incredibly robust on this stuff, including stopping the boats, for example. But even if you stop the boats, you've still got a queue of 100,000 people that are stuffed in hotels that came via those boats over the course of the last few years. To be authentic about meaning business, you've got to address that as well as the newcomers, haven't you?
Well, exactly. And that backlog, of course, is a huge pull factor in the first place. People are looking at the fact that we're not able to remove people on
it's worth 5 years' wait, right?
Precisely. It's worth a punt. It's worth a punt, even if you are in a hotel for a little period of time. So that really is the key to this problem. It's the backlog and it's the huge numbers that are here illegally. If we want to stop people to continue coming over on the boats, we have to make it very clear to them that even if they do step foot on British soil, they will not be allowed to stay. And the clearest way to do that is to have huge deportation efforts, whether that is, raiding these places that we know are probably indulging in improper workplace practices and hiring people that they haven't actually managed to verify are eligible to work, or whether that is going into those areas where we know that they're more likely to be individuals living here illegally, HMOs and things like that. And, then looking what we can do with the public services, the interface that these illegal migrants will have had with the state, whether that be through dentists, whether that be through doctors or A&Es, and seeing whether these individuals are actually registered to live here as well. There are so many things that can be done, but it takes a huge amount of effort, and it's something that neither of the main parties over the last 6 years have shown that they're prepared to do.
Indeed. We should say, by the way, on the chicken nugget gate problem, that is still under review. So I think the Home Office have opposed this decision, or they certainly want a review of it. So the tribunal will reassess whether or not the nugget is a reasonable impact. I like this, though, from Anne in Aberdeenshire, who says, reference nuggets. When did the boy go abroad to taste the foreign nuggets? Did he come back illegally?
Well, I mean, things do taste different abroad, don't they?
Yeah, but how has he been abroad?
Well, that's a good point as well. It's a good point as well. It's these are just all the kind of details that don't actually need to be considered when it comes to considering these kind of debates, because there's an abstract kind of fiction that's created, which is the basis on which most of these conversations in these tribunals do take place. Of course, you are right to point out this case will go to an upper tribunal. I think there will be a lot of attention on it when it does so, and hopefully we might end up with a judge that isn't perhaps as beholden to the whole left-wing law scene.
Or perhaps a judge who is also discerning over the nuggets. I mean, maybe that's where the bias came from here.
Well, maybe they need to bring out the whole tray of chicken nuggets and ask the child to blind
that's a good idea. Right, blind test the nuggets. Away you go. Right, which ones do you like? I like number 3. The kid doesn't speak English, apparently, but I like number 3. OK, so number 3, let's have a look. Oh, look, it's Albania's finest nuggets.
Busted.
Sorry, mate, you're done for. Robert, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Robert Bates is a Research Director at the Centre for Migration Control with us here on Talk. Over to you, 0344 499 1000.
The BBC News in the last few days, concerns over appearance of hostages on both sides. I haven't noticed any hostages that Israel has taken. I've noticed quite a lot of prisoners. I just worry that there are so many, apparently, they say they're responsible news organisations that aren't telling the truth.
This is an utter perversity, and I have tried to call the BBC out on it. Last week I spoke to them about the third time that they've done this, and they just completely pushed back at me and just kind of denied it.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
22 minutes after 3, I'll talk to Greg in Edinburgh in just a second. Before we do, here's a great way to find out a chance for you to win £25,000. Here it is.
It's competition time, and we're giving you a chance to win a whopping £25,000. So what do you need to do to get involved? All you have to do is text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post. It's as simple as that. Once again, to get involved, just text the word prize to 83338, or you can enter by post.
18 plus, UK excluding NI. Enter by SMS for £2 plus one standard network charge by 11 p.m. on March the 3rd, 2025. Or send your name, email and contact number to £25,000 cash competition, PO Box 3190, Colchester CO2 8GP, to arrive by 5 p.m. on March the 6th, 2025. This is a News Broadcasting Network promotion. Full terms and conditions at talksport.com.
Looking forward to whoever trousers the first 25,000 quid. Melanie says, just asked Alexa how many McDonald's there are in Albania, and the result is 0. Really? Is that right, Finn? There's no McDonald's in Albania. Can we do a double check? Let's do a newsroom check, which is slightly deeper than the Alexa one. But I'm with Melanie on this. I reckon if that's what they said. But of course, it wasn't about just McDonald's nuggets. It was an unspecified brand that apparently Albania don't do too well. I struggle to believe it. There you go. Finn, straight from the newsroom Oracle of Delphi, the only European country, is that right? The only country that doesn't have a McDonald's is Albania. Have they got any KFCs, Finn? Can we find out about the KFCs? Could they sort of do popcorn chicken, which is a bit nugget-like. Maybe that would be the answer. Yeah, apparently they've got 11 KFCs over there in Albania. They love a bit of the Colonel's chicken. Why would they not? He does popcorn chicken. If your kid likes chicken nuggets, they will like popcorn chicken, all right? P.S. I know that not to be true. John in Hertford says, I'm 54. I voted Conservative all my voting life, except for the last election when I voted Reform. The reason I did so was because of the total betrayal the Tories displayed to their core voters. They gaslit us for 14 years. Totally untrustworthy. They're liars. They're toxic. I will never vote for them again. They are toast, says John. I beg Reform not to deal with them, and I urge them caution on who they allow to defect to Reform. Otherwise, they will end up polluting Reform. So many Tories are not Conservatives. We don't need them. They're made up of Remainers, net zero advocates, pro-cheap migrant fanatics. My only exception would be Suella Braverman. Come on, Suella. Ditch the Tories, says John. John, thank you very much indeed for that. I think there's an awful lot in what John just said that the Conservatives would never be able to defend themselves on. Absolutely never. They have dined out on the ticket that they are the Conservatives, so what could go wrong? And so many of those big names are responsible for that. Let's go to Greg in Edinburgh. On Reform and the Tories. Greg, what have you got for us? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Collins. Actually, you used one. There's more than one toxic P word these days, and one's a very bad toxic P word. But you used it earlier on, and that is patriotic.
Yeah.
The very idea of patriotism is toxic these days to so many people.
Yeah. When did that happen, by the way, or why did it happen? I mean, it's not the case in every country, but it's certainly the case. No. I mean, even the French. They might have a strange lily-livered leader out there, but they're always proud to be French.
Yes, and my point was that Mr. Hitchens, Mr. Peter Hitchens, I don't know, I usually find him a very entertaining and erudite man, but if he's struggling to know what the USP of Reform is,
yes,
it's because it is patriotic.
Yeah, it's a good point.
People don't really need to know what their policies specifically are on roads and railways, but they believe in their heart that it's a patriotic party and that their number one concern is the well-being of this country and the British people. Mm-hmm. And that's what people are going for, because they just do not trust that any of the other main parties can be trusted with the welfare of this country. They're all betraying, I mean, particularly this government. I mean, it's just appalling what it gets up to. And that's the answer. It's a patriotic party, which President Trump has shown gets you votes.
There must be a lot of people in the Labour Party, Greg, listening to this argument, if you're a Labour supporter, who are scratching their heads. Because remember, Labour voters have tried to define the Tories as to the right of Genghis Khan over the last God knows how many decades. So to hear right-wing thinkers define the Tories as a kind of, a left-wing mob of liberal dodgepots must be news to their ears, I would suggest.
Well, George Orwell said, much misquoted and quoted, but way back in the 30s, he recognised that traditional Labour Party voters, i.e. the working class, were small c conservative and
100%.
patriotic.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's never changed. And up to recently, like Mr. Callaghan and Mr. Wilson and people like these, you had no doubts that they were patriotic people.
Yeah.
But this Starmer, you just think, does he really like this country?
No, you see, you're right. They are. I mean, the Starmer thing. My God, I didn't think it would go this bad. I always thought that Starmer was going to play the Blair card, Greg. When Blair came in, and I'm not saying he was great either, but he didn't turn into a mad lefty. Certainly not to start with. When people said, the first thing he's going to do is privatise, is to renationalise everything because he's a lefty. Whereas Starmer, I happen to think, is more far left than I ever thought he was. I genuinely believe. It's not a pejorative. It's an identification of where I think he is on the spectrum. He's a proper, full-on, card-carrying lefty.
Well, he was very, very fortunate that he could, because in the past, I think I'm right in saying he was a card-carrying, communist Marxist. But he managed to hide that because he just let the Conservatives win the election for him. So he just said all he needed to do was say nothing.
Correct.
And be Mr. Bland. And the Tories let him win the election because they were so goddamn awful. And no one is going to trust them again, ever again.
Yeah.
And so that's it.
You are. Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's a great call. Listen, Greg, you have a lovely day. Thank you. Greg in Edinburgh calling us on that point. It's genuinely fascinating where Starmer is. Who was it that... I'm trying to think who it was that called Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, a Marxist. And I heard people over the weekend picking this up. Is that fair to call her a Marxist? If you're a Marxist, it's an identity of your politics. It's not necessarily an insult if you're a Marxist. It's absolutely fine. Oh, it was Catherine Birbalsingh, wasn't it, I think, who called her a Marxist. That was it. And people go, is it right she should call her a Marxist? That's terrible she would call her a Marxist. You've got to remember that, not half an hour ago when Jeremy Corbyn was running the Labour Party, John McDonnell was by his side. John McDonnell and Corbyn were Marxists. They had no doubt about it. They were anti-capitalists. They were proud. There's many clips of, certainly John McDonnell, talking how I want to smash capitalism. It's a very Marxist approach. Those people are among us. And I think Phillipson is probably in that. I don't know whether she's a Marxist literally, but there is certainly a Marxist component to certainly the way they've approached the issue of private schools, certainly the way they're approaching the issue of academies, where the whole autonomous nature of academies, which made them great, is to be removed and diluted and essentially back to the control of the Secretary of State, which is where it all went bloody wrong in the first place. And I'm not saying, by the way, everything was perfect. You had some wobbly academies out there. Just calling yourself an academy doesn't automatically make you amazing as a place of education, a school of thinking, etc. Of course it doesn't. But there's got to be a turnaround period. Many became academies because the state directive that was imposed on some of those schools was so bad and neglectful that you needed autonomous thinking from good educationalists who could pick up the cudgels and say, we can make this school better. That's not an instant journey, by the way, and it won't always be a successful answer. But the very blunt approach from the Department of Education now, they'll still call them academies, they just won't give them any of the things that made them academies or the previous status that they had to become academies. This one in from Gary. All very well the government raiding businesses and arresting illegal migrant workers, but it's what happens to those people they arrest that really matters. If, as I suspect, the majority are just given the right to stay in the UK, then they'll be able to access the welfare state and all the benefits associated with that. Perhaps then even having the right to bring family members or dependents to the UK who themselves will then be sucking on the teat of the state. To be honest, unless you're going to deport illegal migrant workers, it would probably be better for the rest of us if they are left where they are. It's a really good point, because even if you are going to deport them, you're not going to do it instantly. You know, often, as I understand it, the situation is, right, we've caught you, you're working in a nail bar, you shouldn't be here, let's just check your papers, done the data. Oh, yeah, you're probably going to get deported. Please come back and report on the 27th of August. Like you're going to see them again, right? There's one of the problems. 0344 499 1000. We are going to talk Gen Z as well in a second. We've got some curious ideas about patriotism. Or is it patriotism? Details coming next on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
It is Talk. One came in from Alan, who says, interesting stats on only 41% of Gen Zs feeling patriotic. I'm 36, a millennial, and following Trump's second term, toyed with the idea of hanging a Union flag in my front garden after being inspired. In this country, though it's just associated with racism, so decided against it. Remember, it was Emily Thornberry, wasn't it, and the St George's flag in Rochester, when she sneered at that, you know, typical Rochester, because there was a white van and somebody had the audacity to put their flag. But of course it was, rather than Lady Thornberry, or whatever her full title is, being able to understand that, you know, this was a working class area, just ordinary working class people who once in a while might want to stick a flag outside, could be a football match on, rugby match, whatever. It was that instantaneous, it's in the DNA of these people. That's how they function. They can't really see it any other way. And then they sort of row back. But she didn't get a place in the cabinet. I mean, that's how bad it is. You know, when you look at how, you'd have thought Thornberry, based on that alone, would have given her a place right in the cabinet. Connor Tomlinson has come back with us, writer for Courage Media. Our colleagues at the Times, of course, were behind this. They asked Gen Z what they thought of Britain, Connor. They found that half of Generation Z, or Z, think that Britain is a racist country and only a tenth would risk their lives to defend it in war. What's happened? Because that's way down on what it was just a couple of decades ago.
So I'll act as a Zoomer translator.
Yes.
So I think partially what's going on here is you've got a couple of different groups looking at the same TV screen and coming away with different interpretations.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of your listeners, Ian, who are slightly older than me, when they think of a young Zoomer who will not go and fight to defend his country,
yep,
they think of a young white guy who looks like me, probably with a sort of curly broccoli style haircut, who won't go and fight the Nazis in the trenches of France.
Yes.
That's not what's happening. We have been raised on a diet, especially those who have entered the secondary education system since around the 2010s,
yeah,
on at one hand, Britain being defined by tolerance, pluralism, diversity, British values that the Blairites and their successors in the Cameron Conservative Party invented. And on the other hand, what version of British history do you get taught? It's the slave trade, it's the First and Second World Wars, it's the Empire only for negative reasons, it's the American struggle for civil rights, which has cross-pollination over the Atlantic, which says that basically all we ever did throughout history is oppress black people, were really mean to gays, didn't give women the vote, and isn't it great that white men have taken a back seat? So if you, as a young white guy, see that as the vision of your country that's been projected, you don't find yourself a place in there, and you see all the foreign policy adventures overseas being about bringing pride parades to Iran or democracy in Ukraine, all these abstract values you don't feel represents you, why would you enlist in the army and go and fight for that country?
Indeed. And schools who have a, LGBTQ plus XYZ month, so each day the kids will learn a bit, and I'm thinking, what year is it, for God's sake? I did that at school. We had a couple of lessons on, some people are straight, some people are gay, that's how it is, get over it, you like it, you don't like it, fine, we move on. Gay rights needed to go through a period of, making sure people didn't get beaten up in the streets. No one wants to see that. Stonewall back then did an amazing job. That's exactly what they were set out to do. Then they realised they had nothing left to do because they thought, well, our job's done, basically. We've got equality. Oh, I know, we'll go for the trans thing. It's the ongoing campaign, isn't it? The left-wing thinking that you never settle it. And if you look at the racism thing, which has got me ever since that bloke got killed in America by the cops, George Floyd, where suddenly the whole narrative, my country was being described like Johannesburg in 1978. Or, I don't know, somewhere in the deep south of America in 1968. It's like, what? What is this?
Well, what's interesting...
Why have we been taken back on this kind of imagined narrative that everything is, it's, as things got better, somebody came along from that area of thinking and said, we've got to reset it. Let's take it back, because then we can have the arguments again.
Well, I think the increase in ethnic diversity among Gen Z has caused this split. I mean, you say, for example, Stonewall lobbying for the ability for gay people to go about their daily business and not be attacked, right? If you then import a large diaspora of Muslims, second and third generation, according to Henry Jackson Society polling, are more likely to be intolerant, even if they're university educated, then you've increased that level of homophobia or intolerance or illiberalism, and
yet the same group of people support both.
Exactly. So you're almost engineering your own crisis. But what I found really interesting about this Times polling is the commentary alongside it. They predominantly spoke to ethnic minorities, and one woman, her name was Summer.
That. I thought it was interesting.
Well, her name was Summer. She said, we are not taught black history, and the truth is that Britain was founded on anti-black racism. It's like, hang on, do you think that people from sub-Saharan Africa built Hadrian's Wall, or that Hengist and Horsa were from North Africa when they came over and purchased the UK? Yes. She's learned American talking points after 2020 and is importing them over here. And all of these narratives about, again, George Floyd, again, there's irregularities about the judgment there, but we didn't examine the fact that there was a massive race riot that happened in America. Very few people were prosecuted for that. And instead, even though we've got completely different cultural conditions, our Prime Minister still took the knee. We still revolutionised the education system to emphasise anti-black racism and all this sort of stuff. Yeah, so it's just one big cross-continuity narrative that doesn't apply to Britain.
Yeah, it was, that era I thought was one of the most embarrassing, apart from the dangers, if you like, of teaching kids bad education or having a system of bad education. It was just embarrassing to see this. The knee thing was on another level. I went from being angry to almost wanting to laugh at it, because it was such a bizarre bit of choreography that people were being asked to. You didn't take the knee, as if that was a perfectly normal thing to do. Get on your knee. Really? Where has this come from? This was never there literally 3 seconds ago. And now you've got the Prime Minister in waiting and Angela Rayner on the knee, police officers being shouted at and forced onto the knee in our district for a gesture that didn't even exist in this country.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned apartheid South Africa, because at the moment, if you look at, and this is why Elon Musk and Donald Trump have been tweeting about that, if you look at the way that South Africa has gone from the hope of solidarity between the white minority and the black majority in the 90s after the release of Nelson Mandela, again, someone whose legacy is also very complicated, but there you go. you look at it now, they've only got power for 4 hours a day, they're confiscating land from white farmers, and they're practicing a version of racial communism. And that's what a lot of the Marxists behind Black Lives Matter at the time that people were uncovering wanted to do. They weren't looking for racial justice, which is obviously the cloak and dagger of what a lot of people wouldn't disagree with. This is the reason why they told people to get on their knees. They wanted to show a kind of collective guilt of all white people, to make concessions to what they said were all black people. What they really meant was their self-appointed community leaders, these activists that were grifting off of racial resentment they were inventing in order to line their own pockets. And this is the consequences. People that think that their own country fundamentally hates them, when really the only racism in British law is against the straight white men that the Times didn't bother interviewing.
What's interesting as well, I mean, the Black Lives Matter stuff was, you know, almost, if you were a PR company, or you'd be really proud, your timing was brilliant, because just at a time when firms were, you know, doing everything they could to showcase and preen their whiskers of equality, you know, somebody knocks on the door and says, "Hi, we're from the Diversity Emporium, you know, we want to make your staff less racist." It's like, well, come on in you come. $5 a time, no problem, sir. There you go, ka-ching. And people jumped on board because they were scared to be seen as, you're the company that wouldn't join in with the anti-racism stuff. So, what does that say about you then? You know, it was all of that guilt stuff.
Well, this is why after 2020, of the S&P 100 companies in the US, 94% of new jobs went to non-whites, either immigrants or Americans. So there's this massive hiring drive for people purely on the colour of their skin. And did GDP per capita improve? Did corporate efficiency improve? No, we had a competency crisis. And this is why I think there's lots of young men and lots of young women as well, and some ethnic minorities, large shares of them came over, if not a majority, voted for Donald Trump, because they turned around and went, right, the economy sucks, all your identity grievances are dividing me, trying to stop my ability to have a family, have a house, have a well-paying job, and so we're going to set all of that aside and go back to competency and get rid of anti-white racism. And I just wish we had the same thing here. Instead, it seems to me that even in the framing of the polling, we're marginalising those voices and putting forward voices that import American race politics.
Yeah. And it's kind of strange, because you do wonder where, I mean, that you talked about the importing of kind of that American, the sort of Americanisms and the way that it's defined by some of those groups. I remember just on the back of Black Lives Matter, we tried to get them on the show. I think there was 2 girls interviewed in the Mail and said, we're scared to go out at night in case we get killed by the police. And it's like, why did you just say that? 2 young black girls scared to go out because in case we get killed by the police. And there was literally no stats or anything to back this up. And death by police is very, very rare in this country, and it hardly, you know, when it has happened, I think the last couple of cases have actually been white people, but you know, when it has happened, it's been altercation bound. You know, the idea that the police just drive around in a car with a gun just firing at people, particularly if they're not white. I mean, it's a nonsense, but it was that importing of and catastrophizing something to the point of essentially lies and invention.
Well,
but there's clearly young people, some that think that stuff.
There's a massive overestimation, if you ask particularly self-described Democrats in America, of how many black Americans are killed by the police every year. They think it's in the number of the tens of thousands. It's like less than 100, despite having a higher per capita rate of police interactions than most white Americans. But obviously the majority still killed are white Americans, because they're the majority of the population. And the same thing happens here. Unfortunately, if you look at things like violent crimes, there is an overrepresentation in London of particularly fatherless young black men. Now, you should be targeting that if you should have those interventions if you want to save black lives, because not only are they predominantly killing other black men, but if you want to stop them from getting into lethal altercations with the police, then you want to stop them committing crimes in the first place. But instead, they act as if the police are the provocation. And this is why we get into the territory of things like non-crime hate incidents. That's based on anti-racist police guidance. Because the police don't want to be called racist, as they were with the Macpherson report in 1999, they now have to prove they're anti-racist by going out of their way to record non-criminal hate speech against law-abiding members of the public.
And you don't hear a thing really from the Mayor of London on any of those deaths.
Well, he shut down the gangs task force because it profiled too many non-white gangs.
If you were, you know, I don't know, talking about ULEZ cameras, he'll bang on about that all day long. Bad cars, you know, but people walking around with machetes, you know, haven't got anything to say about that. Bad cars, got loads to say about that. Crazy. Connor, we will speak again soon.
Pleasure as always.
Connor Tomlinson with us here on Talk. Connor is a writer at Courage Media. Check them out. Our lines are open. Back with more comment from you coming next.
The BBC News in the last few days, concerned over appearance of hostages on both sides. I haven't noticed any hostages that Israel has taken. I've noticed quite a lot of prisoners. I just worry that there are so many, apparently, they say they're responsible news organisations that aren't telling the truth.
It's an utter perversity, and I have tried to call the BBC out on it. Last week I spoke to them about the third time that they've done this, and they just completely pushed back at me and just kind of denied it.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
This in from Caroline. It says, chicken nuggets are not the only thing the child can eat. This planet is full of different food. I say the parents are harming the child by letting him eat that rubbish in the first place. Quite possible. Dave in Portsmouth, afternoon here in Reform UK, said yesterday at the Wiltshire conference they don't need the Tories. And I joined Reform late last year, and if I got a sniff of the Tories getting involved, I'd cancel my membership. Come on, Nigel, let's make our country great again, he says. And Kenny in Edinburgh, how can that Albanian migrant say he can't be deported because his son doesn't like eating foreign chicken nuggets? Isn't that what they do when they eat chicken nuggets here? They're Albanian, this is Britain. Aren't they doing the very thing they say they can't do? Yeah, I see what you're saying. So something you can't eat in Albania, is that the, have I got that the wrong way round? Something you can't do in Albania but can do? I don't know. Apparently, the reality of the story is that the nuggets were used as an example of food problems the kid had, or something like that. Liam says, when will chicken nuggets become the weather? I don't know. I'll keep my eye on it, though. Kevin in Portsmouth. Kevin, what have you got for us? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ian. Thank you for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I stood for reform in Fareham and Waterlooville.
Okay.
And was up against Suella Braverman, who's a very lovely lady. But her line was, you know, we're in real trouble here because you're standing. And by you standing, you might let Labour in. As it turned out, that wasn't the case. But my answer was, now, hang on a second, I don't want to be here.
Mm.
It's because you're, but not you, she got kicked out of Home Secretary because she was actually doing some sensible things and the blob couldn't cope with that. I said, the reason is your party hasn't done what it said it was going to do. Now we've got all this stuff about, oh yeah, you know, reform to do a deal with the Tories. No, reform is not going to do a deal with the Tories in any way, shape or form. If any sensible Tory wants to cross-deck to reform, they'll be very welcome.
Why would they not do a deal just to turn it on its head, Kevin? Why would they not say, look, OK, we've had some differences. The Conservatives have slightly lost their way, but underneath it all, they're still a centre-right party, the same as we are. We've got more in common than we haven't. Why would Reform not say, you know, there's a big bunch of people and voters there, we could do with them?
We've done that already. We did that in the 2019 election. Nigel stood down in excess of 300 candidates who had spent money, made effort, committed themselves, and suddenly had the rug pulled from under their feet. And he did that by sleight of hand with the nominating officer, and suddenly 300 of them couldn't, curious enough, the 300 that we didn't want to stand, couldn't get their new papers signed in time and missed the deadline, and that's the end of that.
Wow.
Now, that was a deal. And the Tories said, we're going to get Brexit done, we're going to do this, going to do that, going to do the other. They did none of it, kind of cut immigration. Mm-hmm. Now, if they had reduced immigration, but it's still too high, so, well, OK, they made a start, they're on the right track, these things aren't going to happen overnight, fair enough, give them another go. But they didn't. They absolutely abused that very, very, very great gesture of Nigel's. And I'm sorry, but, you know, if you deal with a company that is forever ripping you off, no matter how charming the frontline staff are, no matter how much you like them, you're going to take your business elsewhere. It is as simple as that.
Simple as that. Listen, it's a great point. Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Kevin in Portsmouth. Graham says the judges are idiots. It's a fair point. Adam, if you were outside with Starmer having a smoke, you'd have got arrested. That's a very good point. Reference Nigel Farage. Phil says, I didn't think you smoked. Not really, a little bit. Every now and again. And Phil in Portsmouth says, I think farmers should stop non-stop protesting but stop farming. Let's see, not stop protesting but stop the farming, how the government would deal with a country with no food. Then they might wake up. Jeremy Kyle's here.
I didn't know you smoked.
No.
Neither of us do unless we get very, very drunk. Very drunk.
Or when we're outside having... No, we don't do that. No.
How are you?
All right, good as gold. It's been very busy.
It's very cold out today.
It's properly freezing, isn't it?
It's proper freezing, isn't it?
Proper freezing.
What's been popular? The Albanian criminals' deportation halted because his son wouldn't get the best chicken nuggets?
But also the Reform Conservative, could there be a... it's not happening, no.
And the rhetoric's changed because the Tories would be desperate for that now and Reform are not interested.
Yeah.
Gen Z think the UK is racist and would not fight for their country.
Apparently so. Yeah.
You know, the borders are open. I'd send them all back over the border somewhere else.
All the Gen Zers.
Entitled bunch of
So we've got
lazy.
That's what we need. We need to deport all Gen Zers.
Yes, Gen Zers deported.
That means...
Including you.
That means Finn goes, but...
New producer today, Finn, who's looking for he's found a flat, and he and his male friend are looking for somebody to share a flat with him. And unless they find somebody, they won't be able to afford it. I mean, obviously, everybody knows that he couldn't possibly.
Finn wanted to point out it's not his boyfriend, just for clarity.
I didn't know that. I wouldn't. No, he's not. No. It doesn't matter what his sexuality is.
No, it doesn't matter.
He can identify as a cat, as far as
He can
I'm
identify,
concerned.
but if you put the ad for the spare room on Grindr, I've got a funny feeling, it might well make people assume that is the case.
I think you might be right.
Which is fine.
But to just give you some idea of the sort of person who might well want to rent Finn's spare room, we've got a new health minister, the last one being sacked for anti-Semitism and the most racist comments. That was Andrew Gwynn, of course. Another Labour MP's in trouble. The new health minister, Ashley Dalton, the Mail have wasted no time in finding tweets from him where he called for same-sex bathrooms to be banned, and he suggests that humans can identify as llamas and women can have penises. So that's the new health secretary, ladies and gentlemen. Ashley Dalton thinks that you can identify as a llama, which presumably means you can walk down the street and spit at somebody.
Yeah, and what a strange, horrible bit of kit a llama is, isn't it?
Yes. What is a llama?
I mean, what is a llama?
Is it like a...
What's the point of llamas?
It's a camel with no humps.
It's a camel with no humps. It is...
We're struggling here for a minute.
I don't think it has any... Well, I'm trying to put my Attenborough... This is why we didn't get the Attenborough gig.
Yes, well, I did. You didn't. I did, yeah. It's all going on. So where's Grumpy today, then, your producer?
He's in Malta.
That's a horrible place, by the way. I went once.
Yeah, but he's gone to Malta in the winter, where the weather in Malta in the winter is a bit like the weather here.
And he's not going to come back any happier than when he left.
Yeah.
Is he going on his own?
I think he might have met up with a mate out there.
Right. OK, good.
It's 13 degrees at the moment in
He's
Malta.
gone to Malta and it's 30. That'll make him even more miserable.
Yeah.
So loads, nuggets. Gen Z think that we're racist, the Tories and Reform, and those vile WhatsApp messages. On a serious note for us, we hear from Keir Starmer repeatedly that he's, the scourge of anti-Semitism is gone from the Labour Party. That's a lie, isn't it? These WhatsApp messages are appalling.
Well, yes, you've only got to look at those, haven't you, to get an idea of what is really going on.
Am I being generous if I say, do you think all WhatsApp messages should be banned? Because we'd all probably be fine.
It is kind of strange. Yeah. I said this earlier, Jessica.
Yeah.
How many